Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where we have unusually in-depth conversations about the world's most pressing problems, what you can do to solve them, and the tragedy of happy birthday lock-in. I'm Rob Wiblin, head of research at 80,000 Hours. If you know of one person involved in the effective altruism community, there is a decent chance that it is the Oxford philosopher Will MacAskill. His previous appearances on the show were in episode 68 on the paralysis argument, whether we're at the hinge of history, and Will's new priorities, as well as episode 17 on moral uncertainty, utilitarianism, and how to avoid being a moral monster. Those first two episodes were audience favorites, and I imagine the MacAskill charm will make this one a favorite as well. Here, we preview Will's upcoming book and discuss mental health, work-life balance, how contingent good moral values are, and the huge changes that we've seen in the effective philanthropy space in recent years. Speaking of books, here at 80,000 Hours, we recently started a free book giveaway, which you can take advantage of at 80,000hours.org/freebook. There's 3 books on offer. The first is The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity by Oxford philosopher Toby Ord, which we discussed with him in episode 72. That one is about the greatest threats facing humanity today and the strategies that we can use to hopefully safeguard our future. The second book is called 80,000 Hours, Find a Fulfilling Career That Does Good by Benjamin Todd. That's a book version of our guide to planning your career. And the third is Doing Good Better, Effective Altruism and How You Can Make a Difference by today's guest, Will MacAskill. We pay for the shipping on those, of course, and can send physical books to almost anywhere in the world. If, like me, you prefer audiobooks though, then we can offer you an audio copy of The Precipice, though unfortunately not the other 2 just yet. The only thing you need to do to get one of those free books is sign up to our email newsletter. On average, we send about 1 newsletter email a week, usually letting you know about some new research about high-impact careers that's gone up on the website, or about a new batch of job opportunities that's going up on our job board. The email newsletter is pretty great, but if you decide you don't like it, you can always unsubscribe. And indeed, if you just want a book, I give you approval to immediately unsubscribe after ordering your book. That is totally legit. We actually launched this giveaway a bit earlier in the year, but we had to delay announcing it to all of you because the offer was so popular that our poor book orderers were flat out shipping all the books that people had already asked for, and likely weren't in a position to handle the influx from all of you podcast listeners. But fortunately, that group has increased their capacity, and so are now standing by to quickly turn around your requests. If you'd like to take advantage of that and get one of those books, then just head to 80,000hours.org/freebook. Of course, we'd be more than happy for you to tell your friends about the giveaway if one or maybe more than one of them might be interested in getting one of those books. All right, without further ado, I bring you Will MacAskill. Today, I'm speaking with Will MacAskill, who will be well known to many people as a co-founder of the effective altruism community. Officially, Will wears many different hats, including Associate Professor of Philosophy at Oxford University, Director of the Forethought Foundation for Global Priorities Research, and now an advisor to the Future Fund. In his academic capacity, Will has published in philosophy journals such as Mind, Ethics, and the Journal of Philosophy. And in his capacity as an entrepreneur, he co-founded Given What We Can, the Center for Effective Altruism, and our very own 80,000 Hours, where he remains a trustee on our various different boards. He's the author of Doing Good Better, a co-author of Moral Uncertainty, and in August, his 3rd book will be out, titled What We Owe the Future, and this time covering Longtermism. This is also his 3rd appearance on the show, the previous ones being episode 68, when we talked about the paralysis argument and whether we're at the hinge of history, and episode 17, when we spoke about moral uncertainty and utilitarianism. Thanks for returning to the podcast, Will.
Thanks so much for having me on.
I hope we're going to get to talk about how the effective altruism community has been progressing in leaps and bounds over the last few years and in what directions you would ideally like to nudge it. But first, what have you been up to since you were last on the podcast in January 2020? It feels like a lifetime ago.
Feels like a century ago, yeah. So the big thing was writing this book, What We Owe the Future. So I'd been planning to write it for a couple of years before that. I'd been working on it kind of part-time in the background. And then basically when the pandemic hit, I thought, well, there's just never going to be a better opportunity in my life for writing a book.
Yeah.
And I really just wiped everything else off my plate and went into a book-related hole for what turned out to be 2 years.
Right.
And so that was really my, 90% of my time focus from about March 2020 until really December of last year.
Yeah, you had a whole team of people working with you on that. I guess, we've had Luisa Rodriguez on the show before talking about some of the work that she did to help you out, but I think she wasn't the only one.
Yeah, so Luisa was enormously helpful, both in, managing part of the book and then also being a expert on global catastrophe and collapse. But yeah, there was a small army of people working on this book, especially by the end, where I had Luisa and then Max Daniel in a kind of chief of staff role, program managing the whole book. Then I had some full-time researchers employed as well, where the structure there would be they would have some specialty. So John Halstead was climate change, Stephen Clare's was Great Power War, but then would also be able to help on fact-checking in general. Then we did actually have a fact-checker who's essentially full-time for, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's from him alone, probably close to a year of work.
Wow, yeah.
And then we just had this large body of consultants. So people who were either writing one-off reports. So, for example, Jaime Sevilla wrote a report on the persistent studies. Lucas Finneveden wrote a report on value lock-in. Or were just providing in-depth advice. So from the early stages, I had Anton Howe as a historian advising me on, what the most interesting historical case studies could be to look at.
Yeah, I have this kind of pet theory that, so a lot of nonfiction books seem to have a lot of problems with them, or the things that they say often don't really hold up. And it's tempting to blame the authors for that. But to some degree, I think it's like a systematic thing that like actually writing a book that has hundreds and hundreds of pages in it and like checking it also to make sure that all of your claims actually are substantiated by the references is kind of beyond the abilities of like any one person. And so I guess to some extent you might have been able to avoid this just by throwing so many person hours at the project.
I mean, it's wild. Like I say, I think the book used over the decade's worth of time, is my guess, went into it. And again, my estimate is like almost 2 years of that was just fact-checking.
Yeah.
And especially if you have a high level of rigor, and I suspect there will still be many mistakes in it.
Yeah.
And that, keeps me up at night. But especially if you have a high level of rigor, then just saying, oh, study says this, or the IPCC says this, and you kind of, that would be like the normal, reasonable level of rigor. But if you really care about the things you're saying being true, then digging deeper into that, very often these claims that are passed around, they're just,
like citation, what do you call it? Just like citation chains that lead to nowhere in particular, or just like the you look at the paper and you're like, wow, this is hot garbage. I don't believe this at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we really learned the lesson of this over the course of COVID with the 5-micron rule.
Oh, what's that?
This is the idea that anything above 5 microns, it might be 5, might be 15, it cannot be airborne.
Yeah.
And that was just a definitional matter. And it went back to these studies in like the 20s and 30s. And there was just basically no, it was just a
came from nowhere.
Yeah.
Oh, I think someone like made it up by accident because they'd misread something else.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. We'll stick up a link to the article for listeners to check it out. But this was an extraordinary like citation chain to nowhere that on which like most public health was based.
Yeah. So it's a really striking thing. And so, and then when you get into, my book does cover a lot of history. And there it's really tough because often there will be, just not that much scholarship in an area, and it's very hard to know.
And almost any big claims or important claims you make are contested to some degree.
Exactly, yeah. And then it's a real shame that often there's an anti-correlation between what facts are the most interesting in exactly the sort of facts you want to put into a general audience book and those that are true. So a lot of very interesting claims were cut at the final stage because they turned out to not be true, unfortunately.
Yeah. I bet that there's a common situation that comes up is nonfiction writers, they kind of write their book and then maybe towards the end they realize that a lot of the supporting claims kind of don't really hold up. But by that stage, it's so costly to back out of saying these things because they'd have to go back and rewrite the entire book and like let down their publisher and so on, that they just kind of look the other way.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I'm committed to this part now.
Yeah, I mean, that's if books even get to the fact-checking stage. So a tiny, tiny percentage of any non-fiction books are actually fact-checked. And so they can have really egregious errors. But then, when you do see books that have been fact-checked, so an example being Why We Sleep by, I think the author's Matthew Walker, that was fact-checked and found to have egregious errors, that was brought up and it's just not really paid attention to. People didn't really seem to care.
Yeah, I actually looked into this a couple of months ago because I was curious, like, whatever became of someone checking the first chapter of that book and just finding that it was wrong all over the place, despite being written by a Harvard professor who supposedly is an expert in sleep. He's just going around giving same talks. Nothing has changed. And no one raises the fact, like no one raises this in his interviews anywhere, as far as I can tell. It's just completely neglected. Yeah.
So it's a little shame.
Yeah. So we're going to do a full episode later in the year on What We Owe the Future, when it's actually available for listeners to read and follow along the conversation. But to whet people's appetites, what parts of the book do you think the sorts of folk listening to this interview might be most excited to read when it comes out?
I think there's a few aspects. So later in the book, I get into population ethics, and it was very hard to try and give a kind of overview of population ethics, again, for aimed at people who didn't have a philosophy background, because it's normally kind of graduate level study. But I hopefully managed to do that, and especially its relevance to thinking about how we can benefit the long term. Similarly, I did a pretty deep dive into this question of the value of the future, whether we should expect it to be good or bad, including just asking the question, is now good?
Yeah.
Just take the world in 2022, or, if you want to pick a different year, 2018 or something. Yeah. Is that more positive than negative?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you did that, because as far as I know, I've never seen anyone write that up before. At least not anyone who's not a friend of mine.
Yeah, exactly. So there had been EA work on it that I had kind of drawn on, but nothing that had done the deep dive in quite the way that we tried to do. And obviously there's still an enormous amount more that could have been written. It's just one chapter. So yeah, later on I started to really deal with these more philosophical issues. I also have a chapter on something that's fairly neglected, which is importance of long-run technological stagnation, where the argument there is not so much that, we might stagnate and never get out of it. I think that's quite unlikely. But instead that if we stagnated during what Carl Sagan called the time of perils, just during a period of heightened extinction risk, that could greatly increase extinction risk overall, where we might have the power to create dangerous bioweapons, but not the technological power to defend against them, for example. And that's the reason for being concerned about technological stagnation.
Like getting stuck in a dangerous state for an extended period of time.
Exactly,
leveling off for a while.
Exactly. But then the main thing is probably I focus much more on the idea of values and the contingency of values, importance of promoting better values, and the possibility of value lock-in than normally gets discussed in discussions of long-termism.
Yeah, I guess you're kind of fixing a long-standing error or a long-standing problem that we've recognized with effective altruism, or like the kind of research project and the stuff that we talk about and prioritize. I feel like for years people have said, like including both of us, it's like, we don't really ever talk about this values thing, isn't it possible that we could avoid going extinct and then kind of produce no value because we just have the wrong ideas about what's good? And now you're really putting it front and center, which I think is, it seems like the book will hopefully be big enough that it can maybe like fix this problem in one fell swoop.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's actually... towards the end of writing the book and having further discussions about it, I started to appreciate that there are certain issues that there's really quite a lot of disagreement on within the those who consider themselves long-termists, which really make a large difference for conceptually how you think about what we ought to do with respect to making the long-term future go better, and just, how we should categorize things as well. And the difference there is, the key difference, it seems to me, is whether you expect from a very wide variety of worlds, of kind of ways the kind of present could be, whether you expect us to converge onto some, basically the right thing to do, like some very good outcome. Or do you think it's actually really quite contingent? And depending on the values that are present at the moment, that could really shape the value of the very long term. And you could, as a simplification, think, well, how much does it matter kind of who gets AGI, even if the AI alignment problem is solved? And so assume that we've managed to solve the risk for the misaligned AI. Does it really matter if it's me or you or Julia Wise or Kim Jong-un or Hitler? Like, how big are the value differences there? Yeah. And there's one view which is just, well, anyone who has that level of kind of intelligence at the disposal will kind of reflect and reason and converge onto broadly the right answer. And then you can go all the way to a kind of a view that posits radical contingency, where you would think, oh no, actually it's just like enormously important. And kind of who is in charge during those critical moments for the long term.
Yeah, one theme of the book is kind of challenging the idea that there's been this inevitable convergence on kind of the better modern values that we have today, that things kind of had to be, like, as we got richer and more educated, that we had to converge on the values that we have now. You kind of argue that things could have gone off in many different directions. I think if there's one thing you learn from studying history, it's that people can believe all kinds of different crazy things from my point of view, or just like absolutely outrageously different cosmologies.
Yeah, so... historians in general tend to emphasize this idea of contingency, where, when I say that something is contingent, I just mean that, I don't mean it was like an accident that it happened. I just mean that could have plausibly gone a different way. Yeah. And so an example of contingency and what I would call bad lock-in that I like to use is the song Happy Birthday. So the melody for Happy Birthday is really atrocious. It's like a dirge. It has this like really large interval, happy birthday, or like no one can sing it, I can't sing it, like, and so really, if you were going to pick a tune to be the most to be the most widely sung song in the world, it really wouldn't be that tune. Yet it's the one that took off, and it's now in almost all like major languages. That's the tune you sing for Happy Birthday.
Is there an explanation for that?
I think it's just like
chance and circumstance happen to us all.
Exactly. Yeah, you get one piece of music that becomes the standard, and then like other people could start trying to create a different Happy Birthday song, but it won't it won't take off because that's not the standard. Done. Yeah. And obviously this is like, why does it persist? Well, partly because it's just not that big a deal.
Yeah.
But I think it's a kind of illustration of the fact that you can get something is quite contingent. It could have been otherwise. Happy Birthday could have had one of many different tunes, could have been better. We would all be slightly happier if Virtue was singing a different Happy Birthday tune. But
we're stuck.
Yeah, but we're stuck with it. Yeah. And then there's other things. If you look, again, I kind of like to think of non-model examples to begin with. So the fact that, now it's at least fading out of fashion, but the fact that we all wear neckties, like in businesses.
Yeah.
Like, it's such a bizarre item of clothing.
Yeah.
There's obviously no reason why, wearing a bit of cloth around your neck would indicate kind of status or prestige.
Yeah.
We could have had different indicators of that. Yet that is, as a matter of fact, the thing that took off. And so that's another thing. When we look at these non-model examples,
I guess people are pretty happy to accept that it is random.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. Or there's just this fundamental arbitrariness. But then where things get really interesting is the question of how much is that true for moral views? And certainly it's not going to be true for many sorts of values. So the idea that it's important to look after your children or something. A society that didn't value that probably wouldn't do very well as a society. So it doesn't seem...
it's at a competitive disadvantage, so there's selection pressure going on there.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas other moral values, I think we can say, they do seem contingent, so and it's perhaps quite uncontroversial. So attitudes to diet, for example. So most of the world's vegetarians are in India, where something like a third of the population are vegetarian. Why is that? Well, it's clearly just because of our religious tradition. Similarly, why Muslims or Jews tend to not eat pork. Again, we can just point to the religious tradition, and there's clear variation in people's diet. And that really makes a moral difference as well. So that's, I think, a very clear-cut case of moral contingency.
Yeah, so I've been on this kick learning about theology and old religions the last 6 months. One of my just favorite crazy facts about the history of religion is, so the Jains have been around for a very long time. It's like Indian religions.
Yeah.
To some extent, it's sort of a precursor to Buddhism. So I think like around 4000 BC, they already had this concern that you couldn't eat particular kind of root vegetables because if they tended to attract insects onto them. And so if you like pulled this carrots out of the ground and then ate them, you'd be harming the insects that are on these like root vegetables. Okay. So they have like that's why they have particular dietary restrictions. Like not only do you have to be vegetarian, but you can't eat like plants that attract too many insects to them. And it's like, imagine being a subsistence farmer in like, rural India, 4000 BC. It's like presumably no education, but like this strikes you as a really important thing. It's like insect well-being. And you're willing to make like material sacrifices.
It really shows the power of culture and values where people can just make what seem like very large material sacrifices on the basis of these cultural practices or kind of higher moral ideals.
Yeah.
So, but then the most interesting cases are cases where currently the moral norm is closer to universal. But, you might think that's some evidence of convergence. Perhaps we've all just realized that this moral norm is correct, and so that kind of shows moral progress. But not necessarily. There was convergence on the tune of Happy Birthday. That doesn't mean that that's the correct tune or even the best tune. And so in the book, I give this deep dive into abolition of slavery. And this was actually something that the historian Anton Howes first pointed me on to. And when he did, he made this claim that he thought if it weren't for, the very particular abolitionist campaign that did in fact happen, originating primarily out of the Quakers in North America or Pennsylvania in particular, and then it got exported to the UK, that the abolition of slavery would have taken decades, centuries, or maybe even just would not have happened. And I thought that was just wild.
Sounds like a crazy claim.
It sounded like a crazy claim, yeah. And I was intrigued enough, though, that I really started to dig into it. And my overall view, I mean, with anything that's historical counterfactual like this, it's very hard to know. You're kind of trying to assess the counterfactual from one data point. But I certainly think it's a non-crazy claim. And I certainly think that the standard arguments for the inevitability of the abolition of slavery are not good arguments. And then secondly, I think the fact that we find it a crazy claim is more a matter of our
lack of imagination.
Yeah. I think we tend to think of other people as more morally similar to ourselves than they in fact are.
Yeah, I guess, so in studying economics, I kind of encountered this view that slavery went away because of the Industrial Revolution, making it like an obsolete method of production, or that slavery no longer made sense even for slave owners or for countries in terms of maximizing GDP, like even setting aside moral concerns. You make the case in the book that I guess that is actually not like an academically defended view these days, and also that it's just clearly wrong.
So this actually stems back to scholar Eric Williams, who made this claim in the 50s. And that was an important piece of scholarship. But yeah, it's really not accepted now. And I think for good reason. So one big thing is that slavery was booming as a trade. The slave trade was booming when it got abolished. So the number of slaves was increasing. The economic value of a slave was increasing. The sugar trade, which was the primary trade that the slave trade founded, was enormously profitable, especially for Britain. So it actually looks like Britain took a hit of about 5% of its GDP just because of the price of sugar increasing. I mean, it's wild at the time.
What?
Sugar was huge. I mean, think of it as just the luxury good.
Okay,
and Britain consumed more sugar than the rest of Europe combined at the time, because Britain was like quite a bit more economically advanced than other countries at the time. I'm trying to think of a good analogy for
is there anything like
sugar
that in the
now?
Day?
It's almost like oil.
Okay, like oil. Yeah.
Which seems mad.
Both sources of calories, I
we-
suppose.
yeah. It seems mad because obviously we take it for granted now. Yeah, and then also if you just like start to think about the claim that it was like mechanization that took it away, well, like even in the US South, mechanization of agriculture, didn't really happen until well into the 20th century. Even now, enormous amounts of labor are engaged in kind of unmechanized work.
Yeah.
There's also all sorts of labor that are still not mechanized that slaves have traditionally been used for. So sex slavery and
housework was like a classic
housework as well, very common. And then also sometimes in history, enslaved people were used in like as shop managers, for example, or actually like quite highly skilled business managers in classical Athens, in particular. That was like relatively common.
Yeah, I think my understanding is the Romans also had this system where slaves could potentially work in these more demanding professions, more intellectually demanding professions. And like once they made their owner a sufficient amount of money, then they were kind of given their freedom, or at least their children were freed. But they could be running like whole enterprises effectively as like CEOs absolutely. For like companies for these oligarchs.
Exactly.
So it's like, it doesn't seem like there's an in-principle reason why you can't have highly skilled work done using slavery, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't talk about this aspect in the book because it's a little bit more speculative, but technology takes some of the economic incentive away from using labor of enslaved people, because of mechanization. But it also potentially decreases some of the costs of using enslaved people as well. So you could have anklets that mean that you can track people more accurately, or surveillance cameras that means you can monitor people's work more accurately.
Yeah.
And it's at least not obvious from the armchair kind of how those two things shake out.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think I might try to cut off this conversation here, because we're going to do a full episode later in the year where we can talk about this part of the book and all the others and really dive into the substance, which I'm looking forward to. An interesting thing about the book is I think it's fair to say I spent an hour or two of my life thinking about long-termism and how to affect the long-term future. And I would still say that the great majority of stuff in this book was basically new to me. Or in as much as it wasn't new to me, it was because we talked about the book at various points over the last couple of years.
Wow, well, that's so nice to hear. I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, it's surprising that there is so much new stuff to say, or that even doing an introduction or kind of something that goes from the beginning, you can basically do it all with fresh material.
Yeah, it really updated me to thinking that there's an enormous amount that one can do in terms of long-termist research that is not, yet more work on AI timelines or AI safety or something. Yeah, where there's a huge number of views and sometimes knowledge that does float around that has never been written up. And there's also just a lot of things that are just total gaps. So Louisa got involved because close to nothing had been written on this question of, if there's a catastrophe that kills the vast majority of people, what's the chance of recovery? Nick Beckstead had written a blog post on this. That was really most of the literature.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to just come in and be like, look, this is of huge importance because if it's, 50-50 when you lose 99% of the population, do you come back to, modern levels of technology? That potentially radically changes how we should do long-termist prioritization because catastrophes that kill 99% of people are much more likely, I think, than catastrophes that kill 100%. And that's just one of, I think, very many particular issues that just hadn't had this, kind of sufficient investigation. And it's not like I think that this book, the ideal for me from people reading this book is if they go away and like take one little chunk of it that might be a paragraph in the book or like a chapter of it, and then really do, 10 years of research perhaps on the question.
Yeah. Before we push on, there was one kind of recurrent audience question for you about the book. Basically, quite a few people have been pointing out recently that, I suppose, so people who are involved in long-termism or people who are focused on preventing global catastrophes, preventing existential risks, many of them, and I guess including me, think that there's a 10% or higher probability that over the course of our lifetimes things are going to go radically terribly and we could die and everything we care about could be destroyed. And if that's what you think empirically, if that's your model of the world, then you don't really need the long-termist philosophy in order to motivate you to work on reducing these risks and tackling these problems, because whether you care about future generations or not, this just seems to be a massive problem. And some people have been making the case that maybe we should stop talking about all of this, population ethics and philosophy, and trying to get people to care about their great grandchildren, as much as the present generation, and instead just point out that, wow, the world is a super risky place, and there's lots of stuff that could go really wrong, and you could be killed by these things. It's and all of the things that you care about in the world could be destroyed, and perhaps that's a more compelling case and one that's easier to make and doesn't require these difficult philosophical issues to be addressed.
So I think it's a great thing for us to be thinking about. And honestly, it is the sort of thing that keeps me up at night as someone who's written a book explicitly on long-termism.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of thoughts. One is just that, Toby's book, The Precipice, focuses, or at least the way I take it, focuses much more on existential risk and makes more of just the direct case, hey, the risk is really quite large this century. And so there's benefits of trying out both. A second thing is just that, how well do these things play is just an empirical question. And there has been some message testing done on this, which isn't public yet, but I think hopefully will be soon. And it's not really clear, actually, from that testing, whether both existential risk and long-termism do kind of similarly well.
Yeah.
Once you dig into particular risks, so risk from pandemics does very well now, as you might guess. Risk from AI does quite poorly. And that's pretty important for the we should really just be focusing on existential risk, because most people who have that view think that almost all of the risks are from AI.
Right.
And then it's just really not clear.
So people are kind of just skeptical that it's a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. Because people aren't familiar with the arguments.
Right.
And so the question really should be, well, which is more compelling, the particular arguments for AI or the arguments for kind of a long-term outlook? And again, that's just at least non-obvious to me. And in particular, I think it depends a lot on how you frame things. So, we should care about the lives of our grandkids and our grandkids' I remember telling someone about the book I was writing, and she was like, "Oh, are you also going to write that water is wet?" Because it just seemed so obvious. Of course we should care about how things go, not just now, but into the centuries that come. And then the final thing, and this is really what moves me, and interestingly, I think Toby, at least in conversation, said he wanted to write more on long-termism for this reason, is just I think it's really important to convey what you believe and why.
Yeah.
Where here's an example of that going wrong. So suppose you really care about people becoming vegetarian because you're concerned about animal welfare, and you think we can convince these people even better to become vegetarian if we talk about the health benefits. And then perhaps people do that and they don't actually become vegetarian, they cut out beef and start eating more chicken, and perhaps you've actively done harm. I think empirically isn't actually what happens, but it's at least there was major worries that it could happen.
Or I suppose if you convince people of some specific conclusion under sort of false pretenses, or at least not for the main reason that you believe it, then it's very hard for them to go out and kind of operationalize what you think ought to be done on that basis, because they're walking away believing something that's quite different potentially than what you believe.
Exactly. So if the environment changes, if our information changes, then you ideally would want the people you've convinced to also update in the same way and change their behavior. But if you just convince them of this fairly narrow thing, then they won't do that, in fact. And so I do think it's very important then that people actually understand, like, no, morally speaking, like, this is the kind of fundamental thing that we should be aiming for, which is like all of the good that could be done over not just this century, but the many centuries that come. Because then I think people will just make far better decisions. And then I guess the final thing is, I think your views on this will probably just depend on, one, how large you think existential risk is at the moment. So there are some people who think that, the probability of human extinction from AI within the next 20 years is like 90% or higher. And I think if you do believe that, it just seems pretty plausible on your face that you should just be talking about that rather than going via any detour. If you think the probabilities are much lower and it's not as clear how to prioritize between, say, values changes or AI or reducing risk of pandemics or unknown unknowns, then getting the fundamental moral view across becomes more important. And then also the more that you think we've still got kind of surprises ahead of us in terms of how we currently see the world, then the more important it is to
give people the right underlying
understanding,
rather than just feed them the conclusions that you happen to have right now.
Exactly.
Yeah. It is quite interesting that so we've got these two different angles. One is like extinction is high risk over the next 50 years. The other one is like, future generations matter a lot. And it seems like reactions to either of these vary so massively. Like you're saying, to some people, it's like, is water wet? Do future generations matter similarly to the present generation? Whereas to other people, it seems like a wildly counterintuitive and completely bizarre claim.
Yeah.
And likewise, to some people, you say, I think the risk of extinction during our lifetimes is 10%. They'll say, absolutely. Like, if anything, it's higher. And I don't mean like, people who are already involved in long-termism, but just random strangers. To some people, it's very intuitive. Whereas other people will regard that as an absolutely baffling and wild claim. I suppose it's kind of hard to prove either of these claims. So maybe you could potentially just take a strategy of, pointing out all of these things.
Yeah, that's right. I also think there's a big difference between whether you want to say that something is the most important thing versus, this is really important and we should act on it. Where, extinction risk being high in our lifetimes certainly makes the claim like this is a very important thing and should be a key moral priority. I think on any like reasonable moral view. But effective altruists are generally trying to figure out, is this the most important thing?
Right.
And perhaps it's also justified even if you're just looking at the next century, but it is a much higher bar.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, I do think there's one thing that is an issue when talking about long-termism, which is getting into these tiny probabilities of very large amounts of value.
Like that was a terrible detour. I'm so sad that we ever got into that.
I know. It's very theoretically interesting.
Yeah. It's fascinating if you're like someone who studies edge cases in expected value theory as an economist or a philosopher.
Exactly. But it gives people the impression that people think that, existential risk is 0.00001%. And I'm like, no, it's like, even if you're on the skeptical end, you think it's more likely than dying in a car crash in your lifetime or around that. And we certainly take a lot of measures to stop ourselves from dying in a car crash. So
cool. All right, let's push on lest we cannibalize the next episode that we're going to do. One thing that is always a little bit hard to make sense of when I'm updating your little bio at the top of the episode every time we do an interview is just, you seem to have so much stuff going on at any point in time. There's so many competing priorities, like pulling you every which way. So I guess at the moment you've got the whole book thing coming up, and you've been working on the book.
Yeah,
you're still at the University of Oxford, right? You're still a philosophy professor, as I understand it. You're helping to run the Forethought Foundation, which you also helped to set up. Now you're an advisor on the Future Fund, as of recently. And I know, whenever 80,000 Hours has a particularly thorny problem that we can't figure out between the 20 of us, I think you're one of the people we turn to for advice, and I think we're in good company there. Yeah, when I solicited questions for this episode, quite a lot of people responded with this similar sort of disbelief at the lifestyle you lead or the amount of work responsibilities that you have. But people were curious, like, how are you doing on a personal level? How do you cope with it all?
So it's a good question. I very often feel too thinly spread, and that is a cause of stress. It also just is the case. So, we've talked a lot on previous podcasts about, it's a marathon, not a sprint, the importance of looking after yourself and making sure that you're working in a way that's sustainable over the long term. I will acknowledge the last 4 months or so, maybe 6 months, have not been sustainable in terms of how hard I've been working.
Right.
Where in particular, I really did a big sprint to finish the book, over the course of 2021. I just really got quite obsessed by it. I was working extremely hard. And then I was looking forward to some time off. But then there's this whole Future Fund, FTX Foundation thing. And it really did seem to me like I went to talk with Sam Bankman-Fried, who was just on the podcast, and Nick Beckstead, who I'm sure will be on sometime this year. And it just really did seem to me like this was just kind of an enormous kind of inflection point for EA, and that I could just be, very unusually helpful, having worked with Nick for many years, getting on very well with him. And so I did cancel all of those more fun plans and just worked on that, and that used up just like quite a lot of my time over the last few months. And it means I've been traveling quite a lot as well.
Yeah. So basically, you've been burning out somewhat, or like at risk of burning out, at least like very recently.
A little bit, but now but the lesson, positive lesson.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the fact that like I had been so attentive to the idea of it's a marathon, not a sprint for many years before that, did allow me to like, pull out the extra gear for these last few months. I also will return to that again. I'm taking some time off literally next week.
Okay.
So that's like this, maybe things are feeling kind of more set up with the Future Fund. Obviously the book launch will be intense, but no, I'm going to move back to a more sustainable state. But I think the fact that, I had invested in myself, like, I just now am like far happier than I was, say, 13 years ago. And progressively so. Like I estimate I'm like 5 to 10 times happier than I was.
I guess, so you're public about having had depression for quite an extended time, I guess, as a teenager, as an undergraduate as well, and having spent a lot of time working on that. How have you ended up 5 or 10 times happier? It sounds like a large multiple.
So, I mean, one part of it is being, still positive, but somewhat close to zero, back then. But also now I would say that I'm now, among the, even if I think of my peer group, say friends from university and so on, I probably put myself in the happiest 10% or something. So that's like really pretty good.
That's so good.
I feel like I feel happy about it. And that's been from just a wide variety of things, just over a very long time period. There's the classics like learning to sleep well and meditate and get the right medication and exercise. There's also just been an awful lot of just understanding your own mind and having good responses. So for me, the thing that often happens is I start to beat myself up for not being productive enough or not being smart enough or just kind of otherwise failing or something. And having a triggered action plan where when that starts happening, I'm like, okay, suddenly like the top priority on my to-do list again is like looking after my mental health. And often that just means like taking some time off, working out, meditating, and then and like perhaps also just journaling as well to recognize that I'm like being a little bit crazy and like reframing
overriding the natural instincts.
Yeah. So I don't know, in the case of perhaps I'll be feeling like on a day I'm just like, oh, I'm being so slow at this, like other people would be so much more productive, or like feeling inadequate. Then I can be like, look, okay, well, sure, maybe today's not going so well, but like, how is the last like 6 months or something? Like, think about like, what have you achieved then? And it's like, okay, that does seem better. And so I've just gotten better at like these kind of mental habits. And that's just been this very long process, but it's really paid off, I think.
Yeah. Was it a matter of finding out that was something that's important to do? Or I mean, I think a lot of people who tend to beat themselves up about work or just about their performance in life in general, they might know in principle that those are exactly the moments when they need to ease off on themselves and like focus on their well-being and their mental health. But of course, that's the last thing you want to do if you feel like you're not being productive. Like, the natural instinct is, no, now I need to double down. I need to pull an all-nighter to finish this project. And that instinct can be so strong that it can kind of override like what you've read in any mental health books.
Yeah. So I think this was a huge realization for me, and I think I have to thank a very excellent therapist who I've subsequently put a bunch of EAs onto. I think she was really confused by why she just gets so many referrals from me. But yeah, because when I came into there, and when was that, like 2012, 2013 maybe no, probably even earlier, 2011, I definitely had this mindset that the self-flagellation, the negative brain propaganda was very important. And I remember she said, like, well, you seem very stressed. I was like, of course I'm stressed. I'm a utilitarian.
We have to suffer.
Exactly.
That's the core part of the philosophy.
Exactly. And the thought was like, oh no, maybe I'd like lose. It felt like, okay, well, it's, sacrifice of my own well-being, but like it's in order to achieve things. And she just kind of called bullshit on that. And I think she was just totally correct, which is like, no, you're just beating yourself up.
Yeah.
And you would do that whether or not you were like trying to do
Did you
good in
only
the world.
just start doing this when you discovered moral philosophy?
Exactly. No, I was doing it when I was a teenager and wanted to be a poet. I mean, so that was like the fundamental insight was like, oh no, actually, maybe this is bad for me doing good in the world. And that lesson, like I started that lesson, and it took a very long time because it's like you've built up by that point this like mental habit.
Such a strong urge.
Yeah, this whole set of mental propaganda to back that thought of like, no, this is important, and like the things you really care about, you will drop if you don't
express any kindness to yourself.
Exactly, yeah. And so it was helpful having some role models as well. I think Holden's really good in this regard. So he's always someone I've always looked up to and respected an enormous amount, and just is hugely productive. And he would be like, I never feel guilt. I never beat myself up. How do I decide how many hours I do? Well, I look at what's my average number of hours that I've worked the last few months, and I work that number. Or like I try and maybe try and be higher than that number.
Yeah.
And I was like, you can do this? Like, that's possible. And
when does the suffering come in? It's like, when do you schedule it? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it is just important. And it means like having those mental habits in place from this long time period of investment, does mean that like if there are like particular moments, opportunities where it's like, oh wow, I can have real impact here. Well, it means you do have this extra kind of gas canister to use.
Yeah, we should really do an episode on self-compassion at some point soon, because it just seems like, I mean, I feel like I know a lot of people because of like the seriousness of the problems that we're dealing with or trying to solve, who are like extremely harsh on themselves all the time, and exactly have this mentality that if I wasn't harsh on myself, if I wasn't beating myself up all the time about ensuring that I get my work done, then I wouldn't get anything done. And I think it's, there's like a lot of research into this now, which shows that is mistaken. It's like, very counterproductive, which is unsurprising in a sense. Like if you had someone who was kind of managing, someone in an organization through a difficult project, a difficult time, they're taking on a big challenge professionally, you would never have them kind of follow this person around and denigrate their efforts all the time, being like, you're not working hard enough. You need to go, go harder. And like this, this just shows your stupidity, the work that you've done today. Obviously, you'd get a lot more done if you had someone who was supportive, like coaching you through the challenges. Like sometimes maybe like geeing you on a little bit and saying, no, you can do better. But like, that's not being brutal to someone isn't like terrible management. And yet that is like the thing that people are saying to themselves is like what they desperately need, the voice in their head all the time. Yeah,
it's incredible how much of a asymmetry people can have. And certainly I had and still have with respect to other people versus myself. I remember I did a meditation that really had quite a big impact on me, which was just a gratitude meditation. And I was very used to being grateful for other people and like feel that very strongly. The meditation got me to be grateful for myself, asked me to do that. I was like, I've never thought of that before, of doing that. And I was like, yeah, man, I really am thankful for the things like earlier Will did. And it was pretty striking that something that is so like an attitude I would so easily have towards other people, I hadn't even thought to have towards myself. And that's just, absolutely the same as well with, being critical and forgiving. Very different attitudes by disposition to other people and myself.
I used to do a bunch of this. I think I was never quite at the level that you were back in 2011, but I used to like beat myself up like pretty regularly about like I'm too lazy, I'm like messing this and that up. And I think antidepressants made a huge difference for me, and just like kind of breaking that habit of being self, like waking up in the morning and spending half an hour in bed, just like thinking about how I'm like failing to achieve various goals. And letting go of that did not damage my productivity at all. I'm not getting as much done. I'm like more energetic and like more enthusiastic to do things because it doesn't bring with it this like anxiety and self-denigration.
That's great to hear. And you do just seem a lot happier and more zen than back in the day.
Yeah, it is just such a revelation to realize that it was completely unnecessary all along.
Yeah.
I guess speaking of self-sacrifice and doing difficult things, a couple of weeks ago, you had a journalist from the Mediocre who's writing a profile on you, I think following you around everywhere for a week.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you're used to this and this is just like water off a duck's back at this point, but this sounds like living hell to me. Having a journalist just like follow me around a week, like watching my conversations and what I'm doing. I mean,
it was, it was definitely, I'm not used to this. Okay. Certainly too. It's funny, I'm now aware that he's going to be listening. So hi, Gideon.
Right. Okay. I'm sure he's a lovely guy.
No,
I think if I asked Gideon if I could follow him around for a week, he probably would say no. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thankful that he is a great guy and genuinely engaged in these issues and just a wonderful profile writer as well. So yeah, you can read some of his work on New Yorker. Did a great profile of Paige Harden, who wrote a book, The Genetic Lottery. But yeah, it's definitely intense. Like I find, like you, meetings and social interaction kind of draining. And, you know, I kind of deliberately scheduled my time so that he could have more of an insight into what things are like, so that I had more meetings. So that was going to be kind of maybe more tiring anyway. And then I had an EAGX Oxford as well. But certainly when you've got a third person kind of observing as well, and you've now got to kind of track, you know, is he okay as well? It was definitely pretty tiring. So my EAGX Oxford, I had a fireside chat, which definitely, I think it was my worst fireside chat. I was pretty tired by the end of that week. So,
well, we'll stick up a link to that so the listeners can check that out on YouTube.
I hope you do. There's one point where I get asked a question, and then I just like midway through, I'm like, I have no idea where I'm going with this. So,
okay, yeah. So it was challenging. Yeah, are you excited to read the profile?
I'm mixed of excited and terrified. I mean, who knows what will... I mean, we're going to have many more conversations, and he's going to talk to my family and lots of my friends and other people in EA and so on. And so, yeah, we'll see. Who knows? Who knows where it'll be?
Yeah. Well, I guess thanks for suffering this so that the rest of us don't have to have any New Yorker profiles.
Yeah, I guess at least the worst case is you can get an enjoyable read. So
yeah. Yeah, well, I think I do remember a couple of years ago you saying, "Oh, I'm kind of taking it easy this year because I don't feel like this is the most important year. So this is a year when I can kind of relax, like relative to the past, and like build up energy for the future." And that strategy is kind of now paid off, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. So I took several holidays that were 3 weeks long each, and did other things, like I got much more into music, including making music. And for sure, I'm still like at the moment not doing as much of that as I would like. But it makes it much easier because it's like, well, I've had this period of time that was where I was investing much more in non-work aspects of my life. That means I have cultivated really strong friendships, like a really wonderful relationship that mean I get like extremely high quality time off when I have it. Similarly with kind of other interests as well. And the biggest thing of that as well is having a multiple identity. Earlier days of EA, I really was so obsessed with the work that it's like, what was my defining characteristic was just my identity was my work or something. And it means if that's going badly, then...
and I guess your friendship group is the same as your work colleagues to a large extent.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas, now I spent years kind of very deliberately cultivating kind of very strong social circle outside of that, including my old friends from school and university. And that's just really nice because it's like, well, I kind of know that like, even if all the work stuff went badly, I still have a good life doing other stuff. That's
a shift that's been helpful for me the last couple of years is like meeting more people who have nothing to do with effective altruism or work. And just feeling like I have like multiple aspects in my life. It's like so refreshing. It's so relaxing. It's so like reassuring as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for all this stuff, I think people should always just think like it's a marathon, not a sprint. That's the mantra I use for myself. And it can be very easy. Like, I do know some people who just worked extraordinarily hard for short periods of time and then, burned out after that point. And it's really something to guard against.
Yeah. I guess it's a slightly perverse thing that kind of the more successful your career goes, the more impactful like each additional day of work is going to be. And so like any time that you take a holiday or anytime you take an afternoon off, like the cost kind of only gets the moral importance of that kind of only gets larger and larger. And yet you do still have to maintain that level of balance. At some point, someone has sent you an incredibly important problem, and you have to say, no, I'm not gonna answer that email.
It's wild. It's completely wild. So, and it's a way in which doing good is just different from making money or just, self-interest, where if you are really successful in your business career and you're just aiming to make as much money or have as much well-being for yourself as possible, then at the point where you've done really well at that, hey, you can retire. Money's not worth that much anymore.
Yeah.
Not true for doing good. It's the opposite.
Yeah.
Once you've been very successful and you're now in a position where you can have
things just get worse.
Yeah, you can have even more influence now. And so that is tough. And that's something where the kind of, I would call it mental health training that I have done just comes in even more usefully. I definitely reflect because with Future Fund, things feel very high stakes, and the rest of EA as well. It's just everything enormous stakes compared to how things were, say, in 2010. If I had the mental state in 2010, I would not be able to cope at all.
Yeah.
Whereas being in a position where I guess I can feel more empowered to look after myself and just be less anxious does just allow you, I think, to become more comfortable with things that are so high stakes and therefore have, a bigger impact overall, I think.
Yeah. You're in this slightly odd position of having had a really huge influence over the careers of, I guess, like hundreds, thousands of people probably out there. And I imagine that conversations that you had with people have led to dozens of people changing their careers, and probably in terms of like stuff that you've written more broadly, it's made a big change to the lives of plenty of people that you meet. Yeah. How does that make you feel? Is that like kind of a high pressure situation, or I don't know? Yeah. How do you deal with that mentally?
Yeah, hopefully the influence I had is positive rather than negative. Yeah. But, it's great. Like, we had one thing that's just been interesting is way back in 2010, 2011, we were doing these kind of arguments with respect to, I was going around giving these high impact careers talking about earning to give. And the twist was like, oh no, but you can do even more good again by going around and convincing other people. And it's so interesting looking back then, because these were all kind of on paper ideas, and we really had no clue on how true were they going to be in reality. What was it like actually?
And this kind of argument of, oh, no, I shouldn't do X, I should convince everyone else to do X. It sets off red flags for a lot of people. It feels wrong somehow.
It's definitely true that not everyone can do that. So you've got to have some argument about why you're in a kind of unusual position. But I at least think for me, that was just absolutely correct. So I gave a talk at MIT about earning to give, and Sam Bankman-Fried was there. And he went and earned to give, and now he's doing rather well. That was that was a really pretty important impact. Similarly, I met Leopold Aschenbrenner because he got kind of involved with Global Priorities Institute, and I managed to convince him not to go to law school, and now he's working at the Future Fund, having just enormous impact there. It kind of relates to the mental health thing a bit. Something at least I find helpful in my own case. It's like, okay, well, if I don't have any impact, at least at least I'll keep kind of doing good through these people that I've helped to nudge in a more positive direction. That is kind of reassuring.
There's this general problem that can be, I guess, for the effective altruism community, or indeed like any group of people whatsoever. It's very easy to focus on what things are going wrong and what people you think are making mistakes at any given point in time. But to motivate themselves, people need appreciation and encouragement, just as we've been talking about. Yeah, and there's obviously, I think at any point, there's hundreds of or thousands of people in our broader social networks who are just going into work every day, doing things that aren't always super appreciated or super understood, whose contributions ideally might get a bit more acknowledgement and understanding. Yeah, is there anyone you'd like to, or any groups you'd like to shout out to now as doing something that's either, I guess, especially cool or just unsung heroes who are going in and doing the important work of maintaining and growing things every day? Okay,
yeah, loads of people I'd love to talk about. In terms of people that I just really value the work they do, which is often just a very unpleasant job, I think Nicole Ross and Julia Wise at the CEA Community Health Team, I just really, really value what they do. And it's often just really tough dealing with, their whole job is just dealing with messy issues and problems, often in a kind of thankless way. And so, I just have huge, huge respect and kind of gratitude for them. In terms of people doing stuff that's really cool, there's a project that got set up fairly recently that I guess over the course of the pandemic, so I only properly learned about it a few weeks ago, which is the lead exposure elimination project. And Claire Donaldson was giving the talk I was at. I think there's 3 employees and they're all directors. And this is just so good because, so my understanding is that a literature review was done, I think by the Rethink, saying, hey, actually, reducing lead exposure seems like it could be this enormously cost-effective thing. And then Claire and others set up this organization while being incubated at Charity Entrepreneurship. And then on the basis of what's so far a shoestring budget, they have now convinced the government of Malawi to eliminate lead paint. And it was amazingly simple, the way they did this, which is going to Malawi, buying loads of paint, running a test, like a very, as I understand it, pretty simple test to see the lead concentrations. For many types of paint, the lead concentrations were extremely high. And lead is extremely damaging to both like health and brain development. And they, conducted the study. Then they went to the government of Malawi. Turns out Malawi actually already had regulation. So it wasn't that they even needed new regulation.
They just weren't enforcing it.
And so from there, on the basis of that study, I think they were just relatively easily able to convince the government to say, okay, no, actually, we're going to start enforcing this.
Yeah, that's incredible.
That's just amazing. Like what, quick turnaround to impact on doing this thing that's just very clearly, very, broadly making the world better. And so, yeah, I was just like, I don't know, in terms of like things that kind of get me up in the morning and make me excited to be part of this community, that was definitely learning about that project is definitely one of them.
Yeah. The new charity entrepreneurship organizations, well, they really punch above their weight in my mind in terms of just like all of the, like, it's amazing to see these cool new things going on that for some reason no one else was really doing.
Absolutely.
I met Andres last night, who is one of the founders of the Shrimp Welfare Project. I don't know that they've had any quite as big wins as this lead paint thing, but I think they're the first group of people kind of ever focused on shrimp welfare in particular, like prawns and shrimp and crustaceans just generally, even among like animal well-being groups, tend to get completely ignored. So they're almost the first people like looking at how do you farm shrimp and like what improvements could be made such that it's like economically doesn't perhaps cost anything, particularly to the farmers. So you could get a lot of uptake, but the shrimp don't suffer as much because of the incredible crowding that they're typically exposed to.
Yeah, I think one reason I just love stuff like this, I think just for EA community as a whole, just the value of getting concrete wins is just really high. And so, you can imagine a community that is entirely focused on movement building and technical AI safety. And then it's like...
One could imagine,
yeah. I mean, obviously, those are, big parts of the AI community. But, well, if the community was all of that, it's like, are you actually doing anything? I mean, it's really helpful for, like, in terms of just health of the overall community and culture of the community, to be doing many things that like, no, we are like concretely, demonstrably making the world better. And this gets, I think there's a misunderstanding that people can often have of, kind of core long-termist thought, where you might think, and certainly from on the basis of what people tend to say, at least in writing, when talking in the abstract, oh, you should just think everyone should work on AI safety, let's say, or AI risk, or if not, then bio, and then nothing else kind of really matters. It's pretty striking that when you actually ask people and get them making decisions, no, they're like interested in like a way broader variety of things, often in ways that are not that predictable necessarily from like what they've just said in writing. So like the case of lead exposure elimination project, one thing that's funny is EAs and names, like this is like always the most literal names. The Shrimp Welfare Project.
What are you doing? It's called LEAP, right? So the lead elimination project.
Lead exposure elimination project.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, very literal name. We know what it's about. But I saw the talk. I was like, okay, made sure that Claire was applying to Future Fund, and I was like, okay, yeah, we've got to fund this. And kind of, because the focus is long-termist giving, I was like, oh, maybe it's going to be a bit of a fight internally. And then it came up in the Slack and everyone was like, oh, yeah, we've got to fund this. And it was just like,
no-brainer.
Just no-brainer, yeah. So everyone was like, yep, totally on board.
Yeah.
And why is that? Well, it's because there's more like a kind of rational market now, or something like efficient market of giving, where the marginal stuff that like could or could not be funded in AI safety is like, well, the best stuff's been funded.
Yeah.
And so the marginal stuff is like much less clear. Whereas something in this kind of broad long-termist, so like, reducing people's exposure to lead, improving brain and other health development. And especially if it's like, oh, we're actually making like real concrete progress on this, like really on really quite a small budget as well.
Yeah.
It's like, that just looks really good. Like, we can just fund this. And it's it's like no downside as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that people might not appreciate. It's just like how much that sort of work is valued, even by the most kind of hardcore long-termists.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, or just like the level of like intuitive emotional enthusiasm that people have about these things as well. I think would like potentially really surprise folks who have the impression that it's just, if you talk to you or me, that like we're just like AI or bust or something like that.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas no, like this is really getting people out of bed in the morning.
Yeah. Okay, let's push on to the main topic for today, which is how the overall situation for people who want to improve the world along the kinds of lines that we discussed in the show how that situation has shifted over the last couple of years, and maybe how this ought to affect the kind of culture that we're aspiring to develop and the sorts of projects that we're trying to get launched and off the ground and expanding. We're recording a couple of days before Effective Altruism Global London in April 2022, which Effective Altruism Global, for people who don't know, is this kind of get together for people who are working on the question of how to do the most good in the world and trying to figure out how they can make the biggest contribution themselves. And I think this one is the biggest ever.
That's right, 1,300 people.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I think this is actually the first one that I'm not going to. So after all these years.
It's like Burning Man for Rob now. It's like, it's not cool anymore. Yeah. I was there at the beginning. Yeah. It's like, it was 4 people in a seminar room.
Yeah. Effective Altruism, it's too big now.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it is actually incredible. Just the number of people and the caliber of the people at these events. I mean, so I went to the last one and I was just like constantly blown away. But anyway, yeah, the unofficial theme for this particular conference is culture of ambition, and I know you have a whole lot of thoughts on that topic, and I think you're giving a keynote about that.
I'm giving the opening talk.
Yeah. So yeah, how do you think people who are serious about improving the world in a kind of effective altruism mindset way, how should their attitude and approach potentially have shifted over the last couple of years?
Yeah, well, this theme is a culture of ambition, and why, if you're altruistic, should you try and be very ambitious or have ambitious plans? And I think there's a few reasons for that. So one is kind of more theoretical. So if you think the distribution of impact is a fat-tailed distribution, that means that the mean impact is bigger than the median. So if you just aim to do kind of a typical amount of good, then you're going to do much less good in expectation. And I think plausibly it's like the expected value of the good that you do that matters, than if you're like really aiming for the best. And that's because in the nature of the distribution, the best outcomes are just way, way better than the, just kind of typical outcomes. And so there's kind of this, theoretical case. And we've seen that in practice as well. So, I mean, I think it's clearest if you look at people earning to give, because, there we can just put assign a number and like the impact they're going to have, at least the impact in terms of donations.
Yeah.
Where just the distribution of how much money you can make from careers that you might go into earning to give is just clearly this fat tail distribution. And so when we look at the people who've earned the most in order to donate via earning to give, well, it's enormously driven by those FTX now. So Dustin Moskovitz, obviously another major donor. My understanding is that he got into giving kind of after co-founding Facebook. I guess I don't know about his motivations before that, whether he was always planning to give.
Yeah.
But certainly for Sam and the other early employees at FTX, like their aim was to make money in order to donate it. And the amount they've raised now is just, very large compared to how much they could have made if Sam had stayed working at Jane Street, for example, which even though Jane Street is like a very well-paying quantitative trading firm.
Yeah. So many listeners will have listened to the interview with Sam Bankman-Fried, but a couple won't have. So it might be worth saying something quickly about the kind of sums that we're talking about. Yeah,
that's right. So Sam intends to give away essentially all of his wealth, like 99%, as do the other early employees, is my understanding. I don't know the details for each person. Sam's net worth at the moment was estimated by Forbes to be $24 billion. Gary Wang, who has helped create FTX, his net worth is now public at about $6 billion. And there are a few other early employees of FTX who are also doing it for earning to give reasons as well.
Yeah.
And so, we are talking about very large sums of money now.
Yeah, so go on.
Okay,
So, what implications does that have? Yeah.
So that's just an illustration in practice of this fact that okay, impact can be fat-tailed. And that was, we focused on earning to give. That's nice and quantifiable.
Yeah.
But I'm sure this is true as well in other areas. Within politics, if you manage to become a head of state, then you're really having very unusually large impact. If you're, doing research, being one of like the seminal researchers, you're going to have, enormous impact compared to if you're kind of a typical researcher. And that really means that if you want to do as much good and expectation as possible, ideally you should be aiming for those like, best case outcomes.
Yeah.
And probably you'll fail. More likely than not. So when Sam set up FTX, he thought it was a 20% chance of succeeding, and he was being relatively optimistic, he thought at the time. But, obviously he did end up being successful, but even if you divide that by 5, expected value,
still a big number,
it's still bigger, and it's bigger than what he would have made if he'd stayed at Jane Street.
Yeah.
And so similarly, I think when people have looked into this, like, should you go into politics? Obviously, it's extremely hard to become, let's say in the UK, an MP, and even harder again to become, say, the Prime Minister. But probably like the chance of achieving one of these best case outcomes is plausibly where much of the expected value comes from. And I think the same could be true for research and other career paths.
Yeah, so it seems like over the last 10 years, we've had a decent number of people who've had this kind of swing for the fences approach to their careers or to doing good. Do you think we're still kind of short of what would be optimal in terms of how risk-taking people typically are?
I think we should expect that to be the case, where, this is a way in which kind of altruistic reasoning might be quite different from, say, self-interest. Again, it's kind of easiest on thinking about earning to give, where, if you're just earning money for yourself, then the difference between making 100,000 and 200,000 is like really great. The difference between making $1 million a year and $1,100,000 a year is not nearly as great. Whereas altruistically, plausibly, those differences matter basically about as much. Yeah. And that's quite an unusual thing to kind of think about.
Yeah.
And certainly my attitude coming into all of this was very much not thinking in the, oh, wow, what are the really big things I could potentially achieve, and then really going out to try and do them.
Yeah.
When I started giving what I can, I thought my personal donations were going to be most of my impact in the course of my life. I remember talking to Toby, and he thought, well, maybe one day we'll have a part-time secretary. And I was like, no way. Well, that will never be worth it.
Yeah. And I guess you were planning to pursue a fairly normal career with a typical salary.
Exactly.
Giving, well, I suppose more than 10% was your pledge, but still we're talking in the £10,000 or something a year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or maybe tens of thousands, but not, exactly not enormous sums. And so, and there's also just a kind of modesty thing, Silicon Valley does a lot to kind of encourage this culture of, really kind of trying to think big. And, I think the natural ways you can poke fun of that's often kind of justifiable when it's grandiose or unjustified. But
they have a point.
But yeah, if you're trying to do as much good, I think we should take these facts seriously. And it is just kind of an unintuitive thing where it's like, okay, I want to have some really big plan. It might feel kind of like overly self-important or something, but I think it's at least something that you've really got to think about.
Yeah. So the clearest examples here in the money case where it's easily measurable. I guess another case where I think there are instances in our head that we can't talk about as much is in politics, where it seems like there's been a few outlier cases where a few people have done an enormous amount of really valuable work, but can't be as public about it just because of the nature of the industry. Yeah. But one lesson is looking at all of those experiences, we're kind of getting confirmation of this idea that we tentatively had, that maybe the right way to go if you're trying to maximize your impact is to take these high risk, high return approaches to choosing your career. Start a business that will probably fail but could be enormous if it succeeds, or try to become a senator or try to become a national senator rather than a state senator, that sort of thing. But I guess there's this other thing, which is that now we've got all of this extra funding. It's enabling people, I guess, to be much more risk loving than would have been reasonable or sensible 10 years ago. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, we now just are in this position where we've been fortunate enough that we have a lot of financial capital that we can use to do good things, and that gives us a moral responsibility to try to use it well. And that does mean, effective altruism started with this idea of, you have this tiny amount of funding, from the Oxford Fed, at least, of effective altruism. It's me and Toby, and we think about how to spend £1,000 or something, maybe £10,000 among different pre-existing organizations. And so you're just thinking about what marginal difference you can make. Whereas now it's okay, what projects could you start? That's like a serious question because you could like have funding for them.
Yeah.
And then secondly, not just what project could you start that would have the highest cost effectiveness with a marginal use of funding, but what could scale?
Right.
Because even if you've got one organization that's half as cost effective, but can use 10 times as much funding, well, by setting that up, you will do 5 times as much good.
Right.
I mean, well, not quite, but to a first approximation.
Yeah.
And that's just a very different way of reasoning than what effective altruism kind of started with. And this is more true, I should say, on the long-termist side of things. So I think it is still true in near-term giving as well, because...
Yeah. Certainly things have shifted in that direction relative to where they were before.
Yes, that's right. I mean, especially because, I mean, the near-termist giving, or I should say global health and well-being giving, I mean, that's scaling up much faster than the long-termist giving, where GiveWell are now aiming to be moving $1 billion a year. I think the Open Philanthropy, Global Health and Wellbeing team are, my guess is that they're shooting for something like $500 million a year. I think it'll be a while, probably, before long-termist giving amounts to that amount. But the difference is that there are very few pre-existing organizations focused on promoting long-term value or like explicitly focused on that.
Yeah.
So there's more in the way of like creating new things
that has to be done.
To fund. Yeah, that has to be done. Whereas in the case of global health and development, still huge funding gaps in, you know, bed nets and cash transfers and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Mathematically, the mental switch is from thinking about benefit divided by cost, which is like cost effectiveness, to thinking about benefit minus the cost, which is like total impact, basically.
Yeah.
And the odd thing is that you can have a project that is, say, half as cost effective. So the benefit divided by the cost is half as good. Yeah. But if it can be 10 times as bigger, that is, if it can absorb like 10 times as much cost, then it will do more good in total.
Yeah.
So in as much as you're finding it hard to fund like anything that solves a particular problem, then you care about the second one, or in as much as you have like close to like unlimited funding on the margin, or you're not like giving up something like an incredible project that is actually working to solve the problem that you care about on the margin, then you care about this benefit minus cost.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I think is particularly hard for, you know, is creating scalable projects, something I think that's particularly hard for the kind of more long-termist giving.
Yeah, one term I only heard, I think, for the first time about a year ago was mega projects. Is that a coinage of yours? Or
So in this context, it is a coinage of mine. I think it's not necessarily the best coinage because it does also refer to a term that
it's like huge infrastructure
uses. Which are these huge bureaucratic infrastructure projects that
like,
very famously like massively overrun in cost and they're like don't justify themselves.
It's like the Burj Khalifa or like dams that are kind of enormously expensive. And so the better term might be massively scalable projects. Okay.
So that kind of gets across more what we care about, which is maybe you're starting small, but the point is you're starting small to build something that could have very large total impact.
Yeah.
Rather than you're starting off with, you know, 1,000-person organization that's, you know, very bloated or something.
Yeah. Are there any examples of massively scalable projects that, you know, plausibly long-termists or people involved in effective altruism should be piling onto that are worth like highlighting so people can get the concept?
So one project I'm particularly excited about and advising on is media, so documentaries, potentially also TV shows, movies. And Natalie Cargill is leading on that, working with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And that's something that, you know, I think can be hugely impactful. So media in the past, I mean, we've had this recently with respect to existential risk of Don't Look Up, I think has had a kind of big influence. But the movies Deep Impact and Armageddon were helpful in terms of getting the Space Guard program to detect near-Earth asteroids set up. I mean, fiction such as Ghost Fleet and the Cobra event have also been helpful for...
What's Ghost Fleet? I haven't heard of that.
Ghost Fleet is about lethal autonomous weapons.
Oh, right. Okay.
By a different Peter Singer, Peter W. Singer, who my understanding is that he wrote just tons and tons of like policy and these academic articles and just no one listened to him. So he wrote a novel that has these elaborate footnotes, like, you know, explaining why it's more representative.
Yeah.
I've not read the book. I may be misrepresenting it.
Yeah. But that got much more attention than the papers ever did.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is something where, you know, it can use like often requires larger amounts of money in order to have an impact. You can often get make an investment of it as well.
Yeah.
But, you know, potentially has potential for huge cultural influence. So that's one thing I'm excited about.
So I suppose, the virtue of massively scalable, I was about to say mega projects, but massively scalable projects is just that they can potentially do more good in total by absorbing lots of money in like very useful ways, if not like the very most useful ways imaginable. Yeah, are there any important downsides to having this mentality? I guess we've slightly alluded to one already with the mega projects comparison.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are many risks and many things we should be paying attention to. And this has been, I'm very happy to see this discussed on the EA forum a bit recently as well. So one is just extravagance. So I recently, when I had this journalist or writer visiting, I took a little tour around memory lane and showed him some of the kind of old sites. And we went to the office that was the first CEA office we had, which is in this estate agent that you had to go in and then like walk down the into the basement. And it was this like almost lightless room. Yeah. And we had like 12 people kind of stuffed in there, everyone on their laptops. I remember a funder, early donor to CEA, Fred Mulder, when he saw it, he was like, "Is that legal?" I think it probably wasn't.
No, and I think we thought it might not be legal at the time, and we decided just not to pursue that.
There's probably some health and safety we were getting in the way of. But
so there was one room that was like okay to work in, I remember, but there was another room where I think I had to crouch in order to like get in there, and it had no windows whatsoever. And you'd have people like regularly working in there and taking meetings. And I was so happy to see it again. It was because it's the last time actually before it gets turned into a different office. So that was the kind of mentality, the mentality in which Effective Altruism was founded, and I think it's important that we maintain that as best we can, where it feels kind of morally appropriate relative to the problems of the world, the severity of poverty, the amount of suffering, the like gravity of the risks we faced, to be in a basement, working in this close environment. Yeah.
What feels morally appropriate is like different from like what's actually best. But there are risks of like, if we just start throwing money around or something, and well, like take a third party, how are they, they're not going to be able to tell.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that we're still conveying the level of moral seriousness that we really have. And so it does mean some things like my attitude to my own giving, for example, has kind of, I've increased my commitment to that. Where it's kind of this funny thing where when I first started donating, I was like, oh, well, that's going to be most of my impact of my life. So I was like, this is really important. And it's like, oh, we're raising a lot of money. It's not really how I'm going to have impact. So I don't know. I felt more like confused about it. And now I'm like, okay, no, it's more important again. Because now that we've got so much funding, I want to, really demonstrate that like I am not doing this for any sort of financial gain to myself. I'm doing it because I want to try and make the world better.
Yeah.
And I think that could be true for other sorts of moral commitments as well. Being vegetarian or vegan. I know someone who donates a kidney and I'm like, okay, this guy is morally serious.
Right. Yeah.
I have both my kidneys, I should.
Okay. So there's the like appearances issue that if you just start throwing money around, people might lose trust that actually you're doing this for ethical related reasons at all. Is there another aspect to it as well? Or is it like, is it kind of important to signal to yourself that like things are serious so that you don't just become blasé about what you're doing? Yeah.
So I think there's a few issues related to, mission drift here. So one is other people might start, joining the community not with the best of intentions. That's again something like, we should be on guard for. Another thing that we should worry about is if people start, having motivated reasoning.
Right.
If there's some things that donors believe and others don't, then, maybe it's more convenient to also believe that as well.
Yeah.
So we are trying to combat that quite directly. So Future Fund has this regranters program. So people now will have their own independent kind of funds that they can distribute, and it's presumptively approved, precisely in order to avoid, this intense consolidation of kind of funding power.
Yeah.
We're also considering having change our worldview prizes. So just like if you can shift our credences on important topics, like, what's the magnitude of AI existential risk or something?
Yeah.
You can shift it by a certain amount. You
win a prize.
You win a prize, you get money.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another way in which this kind of influx of resources could be bad, and we really need to, again, kind of, be very kind of guarded against. And then the kind of final worry is just, something that's less like explicit motivated reasoning and more just you lose kind of evolutionary pressure that we want to we want to, and definitely previously had cultivated. So with startups and companies, those that aren't profitable go out of business.
Yeah.
And there's this classic problem in the nonprofit world that doesn't happen for bad charities.
Yeah.
And there would definitely be a worry that, okay, if there's plenty of funding for various kind of EA-oriented projects, well, the bad ones still manage to get funding, and they kind of pot it along, even if the people would be better used somewhere else.
Yeah, and the trouble there is, so they're absorbing funding and that's some cost, but the real problem is that they're absorbing people who could be doing something substantially better.
Exactly.
If only the funders said, we think you can do better than this.
Exactly. And there, it's not like everyone has good intentions. People are maybe like a bit biased in favor of their own thing, but it's extremely natural.
Yeah.
So there's nothing untoward going on. But you just, you've lost a bit of what might be kind of healthy ruthlessness, where certain bad projects or projects that are not as effective shouldn't keep going. And so I think that means we should really celebrate organizations that just choose to not exist. So No Lean Season was an example of this. It's a bit of a shame because people forget about them because they're not around anymore.
Yeah.
But No Lean Season was an excellent organization working on promoting seasonal migration to the cities, which was beneficial economically. They went through Y Combinator. I was in the same batch as one of them. So they're clearly very promising. Did an RCT on the program, wasn't as effective as they had initially hoped. They just shut down.
Yeah.
I was just like, this is amazing. When does this happen? This is so good.
Yeah.
And so, I think we should really, and this is particularly important if we've got this kind of culture of ambition framing, this really try and aim if you can for the best possible outcome while avoiding risks of doing harm, because most attempts will fail. And that means, you have 10 people, let's say they all try and do their nonprofit startup. One of them perhaps is, really crushes it and is the best. Probably what should happen is that the other 9 shut down and join that one.
Yeah.
And that's very hard psychologically. And, that takes some kind of cultural engineering to encourage that as something that can be really rewarded.
Yeah, and there won't be the pressure to create that culture if everyone can get funding.
Exactly, exactly.
So wow, it's the marginal project is pretty mediocre. This is mediocre. We'll just fund this as well.
Exactly, yeah. And so it's very tough where it's, on the one hand, we really want people to be starting projects, especially projects that can potentially scale. But we really want to maintain this culture where, people have high moral standards, people are able to still demonstrate moral seriousness, and also just that we still have these, incentive and evolutionary mechanisms in place.
Yeah, that last one makes sense to me. That the idea that it's more important to potentially be giving or making sacrifices or not spending money, kind of the more money you have, in order to show other people that you're serious and to maintain your own seriousness. There's something that's a bit perverse about it. So from one point of view, you might say, it's important to show other people that I'm morally serious by continuing to give money to the point where it hurts, say, where it's where I'm actually sacrificing money that I would have spent on myself in a way that I would have recognized as enjoyable. But on the other hand, sometimes I see people who are engaging in projects that are trying to make the world better, and they're kind of cutting corners on spending here and there. They're they'll get inconvenient flights, for example. Because they don't want to be too lavish. They don't want to spend money on the flights that leave at a convenient time for them so they can get a good night's sleep. And to me, that strikes me as not morally serious, because they're not taking the work that they're doing as being important enough to actually put appropriate resources into. And I mean, the case might be clearest for you, where it's where you're doing enormously important work, pretty clearly, and you're overloaded with opportunities to do really valuable stuff. But maybe the morally serious thing to do is to bite the bullet and say, no, I'm going to spend a whole lot of money on myself so that I never have to worry about finances. I'm just going to get whatever flights I want, live wherever I like. And when people say I'm not serious, no, it's because I'm serious that I'm doing this. Yeah.
So there's a couple of important things there. So one is just, I was saying this as, it's a consideration. It's not the overwhelming thing. And, it's not I recommend my level of giving to everybody. And I'm also just in a weird position in the world.
Yeah.
The thing I will say, though, is giving a very large proportion of your income is a costly signal in the evolutionary biology sense.
Yeah.
Where if, in fact, you are morally motivated, it's easier for you to do that than if you're not morally motivated. Whereas spending a lot of money, taking, flights and saving your productivity and doing other things to save productivity is not a costly signal, because it's equally easy to do that if you are morally motivated and if you aren't.
Yeah.
And that's why there's a difference in, what you're conveying to other people. And sometimes, I don't know, the word signaling has gotten this bad rep, but it's unclear whether people are meaning it in the technical sense or not. And virtue signaling is this really bad thing. And I'm surely it's good to have virtue, and then it's good to signal it.
And if you're credibly signaling it, then you actually are virtuous. So,
exactly. Unfortunately, the word seems to mean fake signaling now. You're essentially lying.
Right.
But if it's a true costly signal, you're giving information about what sort of person you are. And so there is a cost as well, though, which is how much do you just in fact do less good? So how much are you willing to pay for this costly signal?
Yeah.
In my own case, I just like this balancing act of, I expense things that are work-related. And so I have a relatively clean division between, work-related expenses and personal expenses.
Yeah.
I still lose, obviously you can't expense everything. So it is the case that I lose it's hard to estimate, but I don't know. I estimate that maybe I lose 2 days worth of time.
I see.
As a result of having relatively high personal giving compared to if I was spending a lot more on myself.
Yeah.
But that feels worth it to me.
Probably a price worth paying.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And for other people, it wouldn't be. Yeah.
Yeah. So, when I read, there's been some interesting articles out lately, basically raising these points that, it's obviously all things considered good that there's more funding available for great projects to prevent pandemics and prevent asteroids from hitting Earth and so on. But people who have started being worried about these perverse effects potentially affecting the community and harming people's behavior in years to come. One thing, when I read them, very often I can't help but have this feeling that they're motivated in part by an aesthetic judgment that people find, like you were saying, even if you rationally think that trying to become a senator is the right way, is the best way for someone to try to do the most good, one can't help but kind of have an aesthetic revulsion to that because of the narcissism that it seems to embody. And likewise, even if you think on reflection that someone should be getting the business class flight so they can sleep on the plane and perform best in the meeting, there's just something kind of disgusting about that too. I think many people who haven't grown up with that kind of wealth but aesthetics is not a reason to do things, and it's kind of very hard to balance the rational side of things with or to make sure that you're not indulging too much in just your aesthetic preferences and thereby making projects worse than they could be.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I had a conversation about this topic with this writer who seems to keep coming up in this conversation. And he really remarked, and they had this sentence that was talking about how working in a basement feels like the morally appropriate thing. But then over the course of the sentence, I started using the word aesthetic rather than moral. And he thought that was pretty notable. And I agree that you could call it aesthetic. Non-consequentialists, at least, would think there is this idea of what's an appropriate kind of response to the world that is different from, what does the most good. I think even with the non-consequentialist hat on, the stakes are just so high, it's just going to override this. We're in an emergency situation.
Right.
So doing what is appropriate, at least from one lens, is kind of morally indulgent or something.
Yeah. I
think the important thing is, though, we do want to appeal to, morally serious, morally motivated people. And for them, the natural reaction
is disgust.
Is this
or at least skepticism.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also a very reasonable reaction. And that's not to say that we shouldn't do all these things. In fact, investing in, stuff that helps productivity, you should have the best laptop. I mean, I still have a good laptop,
desk.
Have a good laptop, have a good desk, have a good office chair. Don't, when I was younger, I spent 18 hours in Doha airport to save myself 45 pounds. Nowadays, that's not
the math.
Nowadays, that's not a good use of money if you're doing important work. But we should be sensitive to the fact that that's a weird situation to be in.
Yeah.
Even when it, if we look at, say, salary norms as well, where it's a weird and I think unfortunate kind of cultural norm that nonprofit salaries are radically below market rates.
Yeah.
And such that people can find it weird if a nonprofit is paying closer to market rates. So it's at least just something we need to bear in mind. And certainly when there are easy cases to not appear profligate, we should avoid them. So.
If people are really taking on this lesson and trying to be as ambitious as they can in their career, what might be the barriers to doing that?
That's a great question. I think a biggest barrier is just taking seriously, what could some of these best case, scenarios look like?
Mm.
A second is then also often just, and how could you do that quicker too?
Yeah.
There's this classic kind of Silicon Valley question of, okay, what's the best possible success you can imagine for the project you're working on?
Mm.
Now, how could you do that in 6 months? Where often, at least, achieving very big things does mean like having to go somewhat quickly as well. Again, for all of this stuff, like emphasizing that we need to pay attention to risks of harm as well.
Mm.
So, don't do crazy things that are going to like taint the well of some area or like promote info hazards or something like that.
Mm.
So I think the biggest thing is just like actually thinking about like, what are some of the best case outcomes I could imagine?
Yeah.
A second, and I think as a kind of important thing, is doing things such that you feel okay about it, even if you fail.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting where, people go into science and there's this strong, like, because they're kind of intellectually motivated, they just want to do it for itself. And there's a strong norm in science that's what you ought to do as well. That it's kind of weird to be going in with the aim of pursuing impact.
Mm.
And I have this hypothesis that that's actually kind of rational as a norm, because the people who go in and try and do impact, they're trying to get a guarantee of impact. And that means you do something that's like not actually very good. And so
you're saying that they'll be motivated to be like less honest with themselves than someone who's like motivated just by the truth.
Or they'll just be motivated to do something that's just not very fundamental or important. So you could do something that is, taking some existing science and like applying it to some particular area. Whereas instead having, like this would at least, like it's the argument, instead having a like 1 in 100 chance of like some really fundamental contribution is actually just much more important in expectation.
I see.
And so I think actually that doesn't motivate this true scientific norm of just do whatever you're interested in, because I'd be really surprised if, say, work on string theory was going to, a marginal string theorist was going to be as impactful as other things you could go into.
Yeah.
But the underlying thing of like, you should be pursuing something such that even though you're probably not going to have enormous impact, in fact, let's say your impact might be like close to zero, nonetheless, you'll still be kind of, motivated and able to pursue it.
Yeah.
Because that's a little challenge, I think. Some people are maybe just happy to go with the EV calculations, but I think it's an unusual psychology.
We're saying that they're happy if, like, after the fact, things have fallen apart and they haven't done anything good. They can look back and say, well, I made the right decision ex ante. Yeah, at every point, I made a reasonable call on what to do, and so I'm satisfied. Yeah. But that's not, that can be difficult to do.
That can be difficult, but you could be doing something that you're intrinsically motivated by, such that, well, okay, it didn't have any impact in the end, but I feel very happy. It was like an intellectually rewarding life, or rewarding life in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah, for a while, there's been this meme that, in as much as we want people to take a lot of risk in their careers in order to try to have more expected impact, that we need to do more in order to reward people who have tried that and then haven't had impact, that things haven't worked out for them, which is going to be like the 90% or 99% of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that we can, like, should we be giving people exit grants on particular paths where we're saying, well, what you didn't turn out to work at all, but we think it was a good call ex ante, so we're going to like pay you some money now.
I mean, it relates to the project shutting down idea. Like, I have wondered, should there be a prize for honorable failures?
Yeah,
where it's like, look, you did a really good ex ante thing. We think your thing should shut down now, but you should be rewarded for that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I guess on a personal level, to some extent, you could do that. And I suppose one way to make it more palatable would be to make it a transition grant where you're like, okay, you were doing this thing that hasn't worked out, but now we're going to give you a grant in order to move into something else, given that you're acknowledging that your original path isn't going to work.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think, in general, probably people just kind of, maybe stick to the existing paths kind of longer than they should. At least that's what you would expect, because moving is it's uncertain. You've got to have the time to think about what you're going to do next, but you're also working this way in a full-time role.
Yeah. And also kind of mark to market or bite the bullet and accept that this thing that you've been working at, you're actually throwing in the towel.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if there are ways of making, transitions easier, that seems, very promising as well.
Yeah. Well, no, should we have someone who maintains kind of a hall of fame of good ex ante decisions?
Yeah. That would be I think that could be very cool. It's the issue is often hard
to tell. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think because otherwise they do get forgotten. Like before I was prepping for this talk, I realized I hadn't really thought about no lean season for several years. And it's just because they don't exist anymore. But it's absolutely great that they don't exist. And yeah, we could do that on an individual level as well.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like a kind of cool project for someone to take on, to create a website of a hall of fame of projects that didn't work out but were good at the outset. Just to acknowledge the good decision making of the people, and also their good decision to like give it up.
Yeah, exactly. Because I do have the sense that, I don't know how much it's true now, but certainly I was thinking this even of a year ago, that a lot of people in the effective altruism community feel kind of nervous or even insecure about doing good. I mean, they're really worried about the problems. It's very natural. Really worried about the problems in the world, worried about making a mistake, and that was providing a like motivation for doing kind of some safe option where, one worry was that's like just the things that are on the list of like open fill funded organizations or the 80K kind of priority paths.
Yeah.
Whereas, it's more precarious feeling to be saying like, no, I'm actually going to do this different, something that's not on the list, because actually I think like if it does work out, it's going to be higher impact, and we get this amazing information of like, this new path being more important.
Yeah, but also, I mean, the most difficult case is when like you have some idiosyncratic view that other people don't agree with, and you're saying, I'm going to deviate from like what is typical and what is accepted to do this other thing that I think will fail. And then, so like not only are people not paying me any respect now when I have the potential to succeed, but the most likely thing is that it doesn't work out. And then people are definitely not going to like pay me any, or like the risk, the concern you would have is that no one's going to respect what you did. Because they didn't even like it at the beginning and now it hasn't worked.
Yeah, that's a great example. But the benefits if it does,
right,
are so huge.
So you want them to do it.
You really want them to do it.
But it shows why you have to just like, I guess it's like another reason why you want to have a culture of like really appreciating people for what they're doing, like kind of regardless of whether it's delivering benefits right now.
Appreciating them for what they're doing and appreciating worldview diversity and disagreement.
Yeah.
And again, where this is, I think this is an easy failure mode that people can fall into, where I think in general, you just shouldn't judge someone's kind of epistemic virtue, as it were, by their beliefs.
By whether they agree with you.
By whether they agree with you.
Because that's what it ultimately has to come down to if that's your approach.
Exactly. I mean, it is hard, like, and maybe you have some, if you're like, oh no, the moon landings were fake. I'm like, okay. And you're like, 9/11 was an inside job. I'm like, okay, probably at that point, I'm probably just not going to, probably something's
gone
wrong.
Might not take a second meeting.
Gone along at that point. But, if someone instead is saying like, oh, I think existential risk from AI is, 1 in 1,000 or something, or perhaps even less, or that actually biorisk is like 90%, or I don't know, or just like lots of views that are like, actually, look, there's just a large range of reasonable disagreement. Like,
because these questions are so hard.
Because the questions are, extremely hard. It's very like, and especially if you're a community that's trying to do action, and I'm like, and take that particular case, if I think an particular existential risk is high and you think it's low, and perhaps even your arguments are good or like seem good because you're like a smart guy, a quick reasoner. From my perspective, you're this like existential threat because you're going around like with what I would regard as like spurious seeming arguments, like, oh my God, I need to like silence you. That might be like the kind of first order thought.
That'll be the naive idea.
Exactly. But no, it's enormously important. In fact, to kind of counter the natural tribal instincts of just wanting to clump together on the basis of your shared views, to instead be like, no, this person's like a good thinker and I disagree with their conclusions. Perhaps I, trenchantly disagree with their conclusions, but like we should really support them. Like that's a hard thing to do psychologically, but I think it's very important for us to do.
So the Future Fund has been one of the main things you've been working on since What We Are the Future wrapped up. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. What's your actual role in the whole project?
I'm an advisor. So, I mean, I was just doing quite a variety of things, is honestly. So, early stages, I was just really helping work with Nick on who should the early hires be, what is just the scope of what the fund is doing, how does it relate to other things happening at FTX and FTX Foundation within the fund, like what are the most exciting projects, where that's prizes versus having an open call versus re-granters versus just doing standard funding, or versus should we like develop projects in-house. And then also starting to just write up the website, decide like what name should it have, one of the very early things we did was just start writing up this list of projects. And then subtle questions about what's the culture as well.
Right.
And yeah, I felt like I was able to add quite a lot of value in those things in the very early stages.
Yeah. What are you doing these days?
Well, we've just had this open call, which was a big lift.
Okay.
Well, it was, we received 1,800 applications.
1,800, okay.
And we said we'd get back to everyone within 14 days.
How's it going?
I mean, we 90% hit that. There was some people, it was more like 17 days.
Okay. That's incredibly impressive.
But it's not, to be clear, that's like everyone gets a response within 14 days. It's not a yes or no.
Right.
So there's, a tail of, I mean, sometimes it was an easy yes. But then obviously there's an enormous number where it's just, there was a huge number that were clear no's.
Right, yeah.
Sam tweeted it. We got a lot of crypto applications.
I see. That makes sense.
And then we got a lot of things that are just clearly just a nonprofit in a very different area submitting an application. But there's just a lot that are like, hard judgment calls.
Yeah.
And so at the moment, we're still kind of working through many of those kind of more difficult cases as well. And
so you're really at the brass tacks level here. You're reading these applications and trying to decide.
Yeah. That's been last 2 weeks have been
busy.
Yeah, a lot of what I've been doing.
It's very different than what you've been doing before. So, which I guess is, you're really back at the sharp end of like practical decision making relative to, I guess, the philosophy and the global priorities research that you've been doing for the last 5 years.
That's right. I mean, it's pretty notable how much, how driven by high level strategy grant making is. Where take bio grants for example. I mean, and this is something I had to learn rather than something I really knew about. But, what do you fund? As a first heuristic, if something is a biomedical response to pathogens, that is not very promising as if you're concerned about these worst case pandemics. Okay. For two reasons. One is that they're often dual use technology. And then secondly, because very worst case pathogens will typically be able to get around medical countermeasures.
Right.
In contrast, kind of physical countermeasures. So far ultraviolet radiation to kind of sterilize surfaces, or super PPE, extremely good masks and so on that just literally don't let anything in. There, it's just like, oh no, this really could protect against absolutely everything.
Right.
And so just with that, like, kind of like high level strategic understanding of like the nature of biorisk, wow, you've actually cut down the search space like enormously. And then I think there are, similar sorts of reasoning can apply in like other areas as well.
Yeah.
The thing that's tough is where there are these kind of strategic arguments for thinking that an area might be like very good, but not like definitely we need to fund this. And so it becomes just this kind of, more
those
like
are the things that absorb the time or
that weigh
exactly.
On you. Or at least you really need to think about. So one thing has been, work that we're doing to like applications we get to reduce the risk of war, for example.
Right.
Where, again, for my work, I think this is like enormously important and I would say still kind of neglected, but within the long-termist community. The real difficulty is just like how tractable is this? Where you can fund things that are doing activities that seem plausible, but it's not like you get reliable feedback loops on this. And there's, a bit of a question of like, okay, well, do we just go in on this, even if it is like shooting in the dark a little bit, or like not getting such reliable feedback loops? Or do we just say, look, it's not, because of that, it's not going to quite pass the bar for cost effectiveness?
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah, I did an interview with Chris Blattman last week. We were talking about what causes violence, what causes war, and the last section I was hoping to get answers to. I basically was like, we've thought that preventing war is really important for a long time, but we're kind of at a loose end on what to actually fund. Do you have any ideas? And the reality was, I think, he didn't have a ton of ideas, which I suppose is to be expected. But
and especially when you're concerned about war between nuclear powers or great powers, where you can build these data sets of conflict in the past and what's escalated and de-escalated conflict.
Yeah.
Does it apply? I mean,
he's got tons of things to say about preventing gang violence.
Yeah, exactly. You can get much larger data sets on gang violence. Whereas if you're concerned about a war between the US and China, it's like probably just details of the particular situation are going to matter a lot more than, a data set that includes, civil conflict from the 1900s or something.
Yeah. When I spoke with Sam, he was really advocating for this approach to evaluating the grants, where it's, you spend 1 minute reading the grant, and then you say, if I spent another week evaluating this topic, like how likely would it be to change my decision? Yeah. And if the answer is it probably wouldn't change the decision, then you just go like yes or no, and then move on. I suppose with 1800 applications, you kind of don't have much choice but to adopt that.
I mean, bearing in mind that again, 90% of them were easy no's. But there was one part of that conversation with Sam that really resonated with me, where you've got a group of people discussing something and everyone thinks it should be funded. Yeah. But some people have concerns and they just want to talk about the concerns. And it's like, but even after the concerns, you still should fund it. Right? It's like, but I think we should just feel a bit bad about that or something. And that's in mode I think it's easy to get into, and we should
avoid it.
Try and avoid.
I guess always be asking like, what is the decision, or like, how is this decision relevant? How is this going to affect what we're going to do exactly? Yeah. What were some of the most exciting applications, if you're able to share them at this point?
Yeah, so we had, a lot of applications in biorisk, and reducing biorisk actually.
Makes sense. So tractable. Well.
Yeah, it's just it's better masks. It's far ultraviolet radiation. Yeah. So the bio application has been very exciting. It's been really nice seeing some applications that just fit the kind of call for projects so well. So one of the project ideas was just getting more expert opinion. So at the moment, there's this IGM poll of economists, and if you want to know, like, what do expert economists think about a certain issue, monetary policy or something, well, you can just look up a poll and you get the answer. But remarkably, that exists really only for economists. We could have it for many more fields. And so we wrote that up as a project idea, and we got an application that's just bang on, and it's by someone who seems very well qualified to do it.
Wow.
And we're like, oh, this is so nice. That's actually great to hear. There were a lot of grants in forecasting as well. That's definitely
it seems really hot at the moment.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a growth area. So including, organizations to just start training super forecasters and, employing them and just really getting them to work on the most important decision relevant forecasts. I'm like really excited about that because it's still this kind of quite nascent field.
Yeah. It has a sense of a burgeoning area that like needs to mature a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another application as well. Yeah, again, another project for finding, talented and morally motivated youth in India and China, run by someone at EA Cambridge. That was, I thought just seemed very strong and very exciting as well.
Fantastic.
There was also Non-Trivial Pursuits. That's run being set up by Peter McIntyre.
Oh, I've got...
One could consider it a competitor to 80,000 Hours.
That's true, yeah. It's a breakaway faction. Yeah.
Exactly, run by a former 80,000 Hours employee.
Yeah.
And it's aimed at high school students rather than kind of people who are older. So there is product differentiation from 80,000 Hours.
Yeah.
But honestly, we also just feel good about there being competition in the EA ecosystem. Like the number of times I've heard people say like, oh, I shouldn't do X because there's already a thing on X. Yeah. And I'm like, oh yeah, we shouldn't start Google because Ask Jeeves has already got that covered. It's like, no, this is not how progress happens. Instead, like having this, healthy, but
shouldn't start a second university.
Exactly.
There's already one.
Exactly. What would be the point? So we got this wide variety of, excellent projects. And I think it did in some cases incentivize people to just ask for funding.
Yeah.
Like Kevin Esvelt, who just, he's just the leading person in terms of reducing risk of worst case pandemics. And I think we did just kind of inspire them to think actually there are these ideas.
Exactly. I'm so glad you asked.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess one way you could just make a big difference is people are sitting on these ideas, but they expect the process of finding funding or supporters to be incredibly painful and arduous, and to take them away from their normal job for longer than they can afford. And you're saying no, write us an email.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's if it is good enough, it can be just a very painless process.
Yeah. Yeah, the Future Fund has all kinds of interesting project ideas on the website. Are there any there that maybe you haven't already mentioned because maybe someone hasn't come forward to really take up the mantle, but they're really cool?
I think the things that I'd feel most in favor of, one was we put this as the final one on the project list in order to give it emphasis, but is actually EA criticism. And it's kind of funny because I think EA criticism just is doing effective altruism research.
Yeah.
Though, there's obviously a spectrum between how much you like developing some already widely held view versus criticizing some widely held view.
Yeah.
But yeah, we wanted to give that special emphasis. To my knowledge, so I'm not familiar with all of the grants, but I don't really know of anything, at least that came through, that kind of was really excited about there. And then also on this, I made this comment on one of the EA forum posts that was suggesting that there wasn't enough kind of criticism of core EA beliefs or widely held EA beliefs. And yeah, I made this comment that was like, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. I would just love to fund this stuff.
Yeah.
Here's my email. And got like a pretty, again, kind of disappointing response, actually. Like there was a few people, that is like, one thing I'm going to fund. But yeah, there was kind of a surprisingly little uptake. Like that, it was, because I think it was the most upvoted comment ever on the forum.
Right.
So there's a lot of like support for it.
For the idea.
But at the moment, like people are maybe, still not feeling incentivized to work on it, perhaps.
Yeah, I was surprised. So it sounded like some people had the impression that if they were too critical of common ideas that are held among people involved in long-termism, that this would be bad for their career, or it'd be then harder to get grants.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm just like totally naive, but I kind of know a lot of the people who do the grants, and I'm like, no, they love this stuff.
Honestly, I think it's the opposite.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we were developing the website, we got feedback from a bunch of different sources. But one was Max Loza, who I know reasonably well, and our World in Data is a potential grantee of the Future Fund. And he gave brutal feedback on the draft of the website. And he wrote, like, I probably shouldn't do this as a potential grantee. And it was just like pages and pages of like really pretty, like, insightful, but like biting criticism.
Because Max is German, so he tends to play it pretty straight.
He plays it very straight. And Nick, who doesn't know Max, was just like, I love Max Loza. He was just like, I'm feeling so good about this. And similarly, if you look at the forum and the most upvoted posts, like almost half of them are posts that are being critical of some widely held worldview.
To be honest, I think we might have slipped in too far into the opposite direction, where you can get like a lot of applause just for criticizing without, and people feel like if they applied too much critique to the, or they like were too discerning about what critiques were good, then that would shut down criticism. So they just tend to upvote anything that's negative, and that worries me.
I think that can happen. I agree. Yeah. It can be a bit of a applause light of its own. But and you will remember the days of Holden Konofsky's The View of Miri.
Oh, yeah.
This is 2013 or something. And that became the most upvoted less long post of all time at the time. And it was brutal. It was really brutal. So I think there just is a culture of people. Yeah, so it's a shame. I think there's just two things that are a shame. One is that people tend to perceive EA views as like this monolith, especially like long-termist views. And this was true for me as well, where, a few years ago when I was like, okay, I'm going to start writing this book on long-termism. There's lots of areas I want to look into. And I just had this sense of like, oh, everyone believes X. And then it takes a while of digging in and you realize, okay, no, actually it's just that like a couple of people believe X and they happen to have been going around championing it. Or it's the most extreme view, perhaps, and therefore is being like passed around. Or the most interesting, So one thing that's a shame is just that people regard views as like more monolithic and more of an orthodoxy, I think, than it is. And then the second thing is like people also just feel worried about providing criticism when really that's actually just like very often just very well received.
Yeah. So FTX, as people might have heard, seems like keen to get money out the door pretty quickly if it's possible to do that sensibly. When we've spoken in the past, you've seen more sympathetic to kind of the arguments for more patient philanthropy, the kinds of things that Phil Trammell outlined in episode 73 and that people might have seen online elsewhere. And that kind of mindset would potentially suggest that instead of making grants as quickly as possible to get resources applied in the real economy quickly, instead we should take the money, invest it in the stock market, let it accumulate for a long time, and then give like much bigger grants in future. Yeah, why the focus on using money now if you're like quite sympathetic to this patient philanthropy point of view?
Yeah, I mean, my views on the patient philanthropy arguments haven't changed all that much. So yeah, I still think that most of the good that we will be doing is later than 10 years rather than in the next 10 years. But there's two things. One is that I think even if you have quite an extreme patient philanthropy view, well, you should still be donating some amount. And it turns out that, the financial assets that we are advising have just grown so much in the last 5 years that we need to be rapidly scaling up the giving, even if you think we should only be giving a small percentage and still accumulating. Because really there's two updates from the success of FTX. One, I think, is obviously now there's like more total financial assets that we're advising. But secondly, also, we should probably expect there to be even more in the future as well from other major donors getting involved or other successful people learning to give. And that really means that,
you have to run just to stand still. Or you have to like make a lot of grants just to avoid the amount.
And there's this real worry, like you look at, let's just take the Gates Foundation as a foundation I really respect. Gates set up the Giving Pledge in about the year, I think it was 2010. Over that time, he's doubled his wealth. And
he has been making a real effort.
And he's been making a real effort, yeah. I mean, they give more than, as I understand it, per year, any other foundation. I think it's about $3.5 billion per year. They could have given more. And the world is developing. Probably the best opportunities are drying up.
Yeah.
Probably they ought to have been giving more and potentially a lot more, like 10 billion per year or something.
Yeah.
If assuming the focus is on global health and development. And that's just a real challenge. Because even at $3.5 billion per year, they're like, how do we spend even more?
Yeah.
And so a failure mode that we could get into that I'm really worried about is just being, any other foundation that ends up persisting for, many, many decades and just losing out on most impact it could have in virtue of not really trying to decisively scale up its giving. So even getting to the point where from the patient philanthropy point of view, maybe you're at the optimal level, that's donating a few percent per year. We've got to scale up and give it
right. You've got a lot of work to do.
Exactly. And then the second thing is just that the returns from movement building seem much greater than returns from financial investment.
Right, yeah.
So again, just if you look at the rate of return from some people going and earning to give and convincing people from that and so on, it's kind of, I think Ben looked into this and suggested it was 30% per year or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's certainly just much higher than one can get as a market return.
Yeah.
And obviously, so even if you're only focused on movement building as well, you should still be doing, as we discussed, you should still be doing a lot of direct work, because a movement that's only about growing itself is not a very convincing or effective movement. So
yeah. I guess, a final one on the Future Fund. Do you have any interesting, exciting disagreements with Sam Bankman-Fried or Nick Beckstead?
That's a great question. I actually find myself remarkably aligned with Sam in interesting ways, including on, a couple of issues. One is this, sympathy to broad long-termism. So I think the two issues relate to each other quite closely. So one worldview you might have is just there are things that are narrowly focused on extinction risk. And those things have longer-term impact, and basically nothing else does. And then you've got this different worldview, which Sam was espousing on his podcast, which is look, the world's really connected. Loads of things you can do have indirect impact on things that then do impact the very long term. And I'm much more in the latter camp.
Yeah.
And that's good. Again, hopefully the book gives some kind of background explanation for that. But part of that is this kind of contingency versus convergence of values idea as well, where if you think it's really matters, who's in charge, who has the power at these critical junctures, like development of AGI or first space exploration or formation of a world government, then loads of things change that.
Yeah.
And that means you can affect the long-term future in just an enormous number of ways. Probably the biggest disagreement I'd have with Sam is there's a kind of a spectrum of how cautious versus, gung-ho you are.
Yeah.
Sam is just very keen on being, very keen on building things, just making things happen. And I'm really pretty sympathetic to that compared to many people, but he's definitely further on the tail of that than me.
Yeah. And Nick?
Oh yeah. And then Nick, plenty of disagreements actually. And also just have more time to talk about them. So a few recently, one on this contingency versus convergence thing, Nick is much more sympathetic to the idea of convergence. Then we also have some differences in how we think about making grants, and that's something that's been an ongoing, or assessing organizations. And that's been an interesting and ongoing conversation where I am more inclined to look at past track record and not pay that much attention to like future plans. And whereas Nick is more inclined than me to like really dig into like the plans going forward.
Yeah.
And well, Nick, when he's on the podcast, perhaps can defend his view. I think partly I find it just from setting up organizations myself and being like the recipient.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, look, I can make these plans. They're going to change. Probably most of the impact will come via these like weird things we don't expect.
Yeah.
Whereas you can look at, track record and like the people involved is like...
That's more measurable.
More measurable, exactly. So that's pretty interesting. And then there's also just a question of kind of, do you err on the side of like, what is cautiousness in this current context in terms of funding? Is that like erring on the side of giving people more or giving people less? And I'm like, I tend to be a little bit happier on the side of giving people more.
Yeah.
But again, these are matters of detail, but they really matter for grant makings.
Yeah. Okay, so we're almost done, but we got a ton of audience submitted questions for you, and I'd like to throw a few of them at you quickly in a kind of rapid fire session.
Okay, I'll try my best to be brief.
Yeah, what's your take on the idea that we should give special priority to S risks or like possible futures in which there's a lot of suffering rather than just nothing?
Yeah, I think it depends exactly on what you mean by special priority. So I definitely think we should give more priority to it than in some sense of a world that has an equal quantity of happiness. So under model uncertainty, you've got kind of, say, classical utilitarian view, which would say that, let's say it's defining one unit of happiness and one unit of suffering. And there's a reasonable case to think that on the classical utilitarian view, we should think like the best possible future is as good as the worst possible future is bad. But we shouldn't be extremely confident in that. There are plausible views in which you should give more weight to suffering, or in general to worst case outcomes. So you could be risk averse too. You could also have a prioritarian view, which, depending on exactly how you model it, can give extra weight to very worst lives. So I think we should take that into account too. But then what happens? Well, you end up with kind of a mix between the two.
Yeah.
So supposing you were 50-50 between classical utilitarian view and just like strict negative utilitarian view, well, then I think on the natural way of making the comparison between the two views, you give suffering twice as much weight as you otherwise would. I think that's like a pretty reasonable kind of conclusion to come to. Something that's pretty interesting to interrogate is like, if you ask yourself, like, what trade-offs would you in fact make if you're like, you've got these decisions ahead of you, like some chance of heaven and some chance of hell, like at what probability are you indifferent? Like,
I feel very risk averse about that sort of thing. I suppose like I still feel quite risk averse even in like more normal cases where it's like you'll have a great day or a terrible day. You get more and more risk averse the more extreme the case.
Yeah. And so that does suggest that there's just also like, this common sense argument for caring more about avoiding the downsides than getting the upsides. Putting all of that together, I think it gives I think there's some arguments on which S-risk are all that matters, but I think you only get that if you assign like very high credence to, a pretty narrow range of model views. Whereas if you also have credence on the views on which positives count a lot as well, then you get more like this kind of mixed view where you give some extra weight to downsides compared to upsides. I think this does give, some extra weight for trajectory changes versus extinction risk reduction, but not like overwhelming importance.
Yeah. So I guess for the rest of the year, you've kind of got the book and the future fund are going to be pretty time absorbing. But what do you think you might be working on in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time? Yeah,
so it's still a great question. I do think, I think there's two things that kind of weigh on me. One is I do just really enjoy, getting very kind of bright, younger people kind of engaged in these ideas. I find that like personally very motivating and inspiring. It's like people have their whole life behind them and they got this youthful energy and stuff. And I feel like often like relatively low amounts of effort can really help people and put in the right path.
I feel like we should get you in like very occasionally to be like a one-on-one career advisor, and people could just like randomly get Will as their advisor, perhaps, if that's energizing for you.
I used to do career advice and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. So that's kind of one thing. And it's also just like, given my views about the world, just growing the number of people who are, morally serious and intellectually curious, who are trying to make the world better. It's just like plausibly the most important thing.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, well, what's the thing that I feel is lacking most? And I think that is just I call it weird macro strategy research, but I should come up with a better name than that.
Better branding, yeah.
But Holden has this post, Most Important Research Questions for the Most Important Century, some title like that. And he's just like, he's focusing in particular on AI, and he's more negative on issues that are a bit broader than that. At least for the bit that's saying like, look, it is super important to have more people working on this, and the style of investigation that he's encouraging, which are like, it is actually kind of bold, ambitious research where you're not just saying, hey, I'm just going to look at one case study and just pass that to everyone. Instead, it's like, I'm trying to develop a view here, like a real view on AI timelines, or the importance of who develops AGI versus like AI, risk for misaligned AI, or like how fast should we expect an AI takeoff to be? Just like, I'm going to try and have a view on this and defend it. And I'm going to go really deep as well. And he points out just very few people are doing this. Like, people often say like, oh, the EA is just full of researchers, but like not that many people are doing that sort of research. And it just seems enormously important to me. And so like, yeah, that was just one of my favorite forum posts that I've read in a long time. I would go a bit broader than Holden. He was kind of more critical of attempts to find cause X or have crucial considerations, basically on the grounds that it's really hard and he didn't expect people to succeed. I agree it's hard and people probably won't succeed, but well, this whole conversation has been about like, well, the payoff could be like very large. So at least I'm more sympathetic to that. Though I don't really feel I want to claim it's more important than some of the AI topics that he was talking about. And then there's another one which was trying to form your own worldview, where I think there I feel even more sympathetic to wanting to defend the worldview thing. I just find it's like...
What do you mean by
that? There, I think it's like even broader than just tackling one of these questions like AI takeoff speeds or AI timelines. But instead, it's having a pretty broad view kind of everything. So it's a little hard to convey. Carl Schulman is the person that I think most has this.
Most embodies that,
but he manages to have like both incredible breadth and depth.
He's a special guy.
But I think it's because just, since he was a teenager, he was just like, I want to figure out how the world works and what's most important and like how it all fits together. And like, how many people are trying to do that in the world? Like, truly? Almost none. It's like extremely out of fashion in academia. There's very few people who have the kind of opportunity to do that. And I just think, I do think it just has enormous
potential upside.
Enormous potential upside. And so putting both of those things together, one idea that, I do come back to, and Leopold Aschenbrenner in particular has recently been pushing me on is like, having my own university or research institute. You combine, do both of those things.
Oh, yeah. Will you fund people to come up with their own worldview or like really dig deep? Okay.
So, so you'd like find like super, super promising people at an early stage, rather than, they come to this rather than like standard university.
All right, you've got 30 years.
I mean, that would be an extreme version of it, but there's a really difficult incentives question where on the one hand, like the best research just does take a long time, but on the other hand, you don't want to just simply say like, okay, you're now funded forever. But you could have some like...
Some people are super intrinsically motivated by this. And I think you would have to be in order to stick with it.
Yeah, for sure. But then you could also have it where like most people go off, like don't, pursue that kind of research path. And so, that's something I could imagine myself kind of getting very excited by. And so, something I think about. Other obvious paths are like more kind of public intellectual work, perhaps, working more with Future Fund, maybe writing more books. Another one is that I feel a bit of urge towards is like, really going deep on AI as well. It's kind of the in thing to do, No,
finally succumb.
I know. I've tried to hold off for so long, but it just is. It just like is very important in expectation. It's also where like a lot of focus of the community of many researchers is at the moment. It's something where I'm like, there's just lots of things I feel confused about, especially what's coming out of the research area, and I'm like, so it feels like these open threads that I like really want to dig into, and I'm always like, it's not quite, it's not the thing I should be doing. But so those are some of the things most on my mind.
Yeah, I guess so. Listeners are dying to know what is it with you and potatoes?
I just think they're neat.
This might be a little bit injected. I think when I say listeners are dying to know, I mean two listeners. But
two listeners. So yeah, this did come up at the last EA Global London. So yeah, during, I think it was like May, June 2020, the kind of peak of lockdown madness.
Yeah.
I was working hard in the book, and I was often going down kind of rabbit holes that were often very useful. But one I went down was the history of the potato and the potato's long-term impact. And an early draft of the book had a lot of potato-related content. People didn't really like it.
Yeah. It's mostly just a book about potatoes at this point. Yeah.
I do now own many books about potatoes.
Yeah.
And it stemmed from, so the potato was one of the most important transformative technologies of all time.
Yeah. Tell me more.
When it was first imported to Europe from South America, it was regarded with quite a lot of skepticism because people thought that it would give you leprosy because the skin was looked like the skin of a leper. But it was also just like a radically new sort of vegetable. And so it took a while to take off. But then those areas that were suitable for potato-based agriculture and started using it, well, there's one study that suggests that they had radically more urbanization and population growth. So it had, basically, you could get 3 times as many calories per acre from the potato as you could from
wheat? Or
from wheat.
Wow.
Or
it's just so fast growing, or just so efficient at converting sunlight into calories.
Yeah, basically. And it's also quite close to a superfood. So there's this paper, it's by Nathan Nunn and one co-author. It has a section, and it's like got thousands of citations in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Yeah. And it's like section 2, the virtues of the potato. And it's like comparing potatoes to turnips. So potatoes, you can, at least if you're an agricultural worker requiring more calories per day, you can live on nothing but buttery mashed potatoes. So
in reasonable health?
In reasonable health, yeah. So you get all the relevant nutrients, apart from vitamin D and K, which you can get from milk. You also need occasional supplement of like lentils or oats for the molybdenum. But basically, to a first approximation, buttery mashed potatoes can just be your life.
Yeah.
And so, it seemed to be actually just very good nutritionally as well. So it's kind of, the joke I started making was you can draw this analogies between the potato and AI, because it was this like discontinuous technological advancement that in some ways was more general than previous previous vegetables. But it was also recursively self-improving.
Because we kept selecting the best potatoes?
Well, no, because you could, by growing potatoes, it actually was also very good feed for livestock, which produced manure, which allowed you to make many more potatoes. Okay. And were you thinking that's a bit of a stretch?
Well, I was thinking, how many cycles of improvement do you get out of that?
You do plateau. Yeah. But I think that is also that is relevant. Where
that could happen with
exactly
AI,
getting a bit of self-improvement doesn't mean you go forever necessarily.
Yeah, totally.
You can plateau, and it is relevant for thinking about automation, kind of more generally, or like productivity improvements more generally, where agriculture in general, we've had these like enormous productivity gains and automation, and actually that's meant that agriculture has become a much smaller part of the economy rather than a bigger one, because like it's the stuff that's like hard to automate but essential that ends up becoming kind of the bottleneck and swells to become the whole economy. And that could well happen with AI as well. And there's this like economic model on how this might go and how that could be like a bottleneck to kind of singularity-esque growth.
Yeah.
But people thought it was a little flippant.
Right. Didn't make it into the final cut. I think there's almost no mentions of potatoes in the book.
Sadly, it's all gone. Okay, but I have been approached for people asking for it for the perhaps a standalone article. So maybe it will still see the light of day.
Yeah.
There's a bit. I have commissioned research onto this because the other part of the issue is like the core persistent study. Oh yeah, I did a little bit of. So if you take the persistent study and then just extrapolate it out, then if the potato had never been imported, had never existed, or hadn't been imported to Europe, 1 billion fewer people would be alive today.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
But the question
kind of makes it surprising that the civilizations in the Americas, weren't more powerful or weren't more populous. And if it's so much more efficient at producing calories, you'd think that would be a huge advantage in terms of getting economies of scale and being at the forefront of technological development.
Yeah, I mean that's actually kind of maybe a good argument for some amount of skepticism about the study.
Okay, yeah. Right.
So I have asked Jaime to, look into it, because I'm confident the effect size will not be as large as it actually is as is stated in the paper.
Yeah.
And then, is it zero? I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but our traditional last question is, do you have 3 books about potatoes that you can recommend to listeners?
I'll have to get back to you, but
cool.
There was a book called The Potato King that my team got me.
Yeah. An original edition, first edition?
No, sadly not. And we did once have a party that was potato themed, where everyone's dressed in kind of potato sacks that we made into various costumes. So that was my pandemic.
Okay. We've all changed in our own way. All right, we'll be back soon with another interview about what we owe the future. But for now, thanks for coming back on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Will.
Cool, thanks for having me, Rob.
A few little factual corrections to make on this one. Will gave some thanks to people who contributed to the book, which is always a risky proposition, as you can easily forget someone in the list. And in this case, he omitted Laura Pomarius, who was his chief of staff before Max took over. Will mentioned Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, and said that came out in the 50s, but actually it came out in the 40s. He also mentioned the Gates Foundation currently giving out about $3.5 billion in grants a year, but apparently at the moment they are currently giving out more like $6 billion a year. For my part, I got my dates about Jainism wrong. Jainism's origins are a bit hard to pin down, but the religion probably originates more like 500 to 800 BC rather than 4000 BC, which is what I suggested. For a religion that might go back that far, you'd probably have to turn to the ancient Egyptians, and even that might be pushing it. Oh well, what's a few millennia between friends? If things go to plan, which once in a while they do, the next of my interviews to go out will actually be on the 80K After Hours feed rather than this one. That will be a conversation with 2 expert forecasters about how they go about predicting interstate conflict ahead of time and what's hot in the predicting the future scene at the moment. If that sounds at all interesting to you, go and subscribe to 80K After Hours wherever you get this show. And just a reminder about the book giveaway I mentioned in the intro. If you'd like a free copy of either The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity by Toby Ord, or 80,000 Hours, Find a Fulfilling Career That Does Good by Benjamin Todd, or Doing Good Better, Effective Altruism and How You Can Make a Difference by today's guest, Will, then you can go and get it at 80,000hours.org/freebook in exchange for joining our weekly email newsletter. Or in exchange for subscribing and insta-unsubscribing. That is also cool. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris, audio mastering and technical editing by Ben Cordell. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.